This is The Longest Step, written by Beryl Coops. Chapter 1.
The key clicked home on the last letter, and the transmitter's coil sang hot under his hand. Pilgrim kept his fist on the Morse key long enough to ride the fading. The message was short and jagged, like the breath in his chest. Call sign, time, target grid, confirmation. He did not include the thing that mattered most. That one lived in his skull like a coal, too bright to trust to airwaves tonight. He reached for the blackout curtain and stilled. Footsteps on the stair. Not one. Two. Then a third, lagging. Men who didn't wish to be heard would have moved on the balls of their feet. These were boots. Confident ones. The bookshop below was shuttered. Paper in the windows, dust on the ledge. Mrs. Arnaud, the safe housekeeper, always climbed in twos. Her and her basket. She laughed as she climbed. There was no laughter now. Pilgrim's hand tightened on the key. He slipped the aerial lead free, wound the cable and flattened the set's cloth cover. He could feel the Terrier in those measured steps. He'd never met the man, but every operator in the region spoke of him the way miners talk about gas in the seam. No shape, only certainty. A nose, they said. A terrier's nose for disgrace. He worried a scent until it bled truth. Betrayal, then. From where? The net was stripped to bone. One courier to this flat, one keeper, one fallback. No more. He pulled the floorboard that wore a notch of oil from other quieter nights. The codebook and emergency pills went into the gap. The real secret, names, dates, a sudden shift in the enemy's rail movements, burned behind his eyes where it had to stay. If he died, it had to die with him. If he lived, it must cross the mountains to British High Command intact. There was a timetable in it, a flaw, a place to break the teeth of the occupier if the message survived him. The stair paused outside the door. A soft knock, then another, the rhythm wrong. Mrs. Arnaud's pattern was always 2 and 1. This was 1 and 2. He lifted the latch from below with a butter knife and tied it off, so any push would catch. Then he stepped back and took in the room. One window to an alley roof, one door to the landing. The trap to the ceiling had been painted shut by a man who'd never had to move quickly. "Madame?" he called softly. No answer, only a breath, like a man who'd run a little and was sorry he had. He crossed to the window and eased it up. The alley's stink rose in a slow wave. Stale cabbage, coal dust, river damp. Rain glazed the slates. A cart below made a click-click under the drip. The drop wasn't far, 10 feet to the cart's canvas. He put a leg over the sill. The latch snapped. The door bowed. "Pilgrim," a man said through the wood, calm as a banker on a Monday. "Don't." The voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. There was patience in it. No hurry, no heat. The Terrier, he knew. How else could a stranger sound like he owned the air between the liver and the lungs? Pilgrim slid out and went for the cart. The canvas bowed and split, and he went through to the crates below, catching an edge with his ribs. Pain whitewashed his breath. He rolled, dropped, sprinted. An alley cat leapt and hissed. A bottle smashed at his heel. The shop's back door banged open above and boots bled into the alley. Don't think. Move. He cut left into an arcade where pools of lamplight made islands on the stone. Stalls sat folded like sleeping birds. A wind lifted brown paper and sent it fluttering down the aisle. He kept to the edge where shadow pooled. The market opened onto a square, and the square opened onto the river road where trucks grumbled in convoy. If he hit the river, he'd be swept into a searchlight and a checkpoint. If he went up, he'd run into the patrols that combed the hills around the old fort. His only direction was sideways. Sideways, always sideways, until the Terrier lost the line. The first shout came from behind, authoritative, clipped. A second answered from the square. They'd split him already, pressure at front and back. He veered through a stack of wicker baskets, sent them skittering. The basket seller swore and threw something iron. It chimed off a post and rang in his ear. He cut through a butcher's shutter gap and into the lane behind. Meat-sweet cold slapped him. He shouldered through hanging carcasses, brushed ice from his cheek with the back of his wrist, and slipped out past a drain where rainwater ran like steel wire. Thoughts, like gulls in a storm, kept coming back to the same single point. Mayalen, Ika, are they safe? He'd never met them, only heard their names as if they were saints painted in smoke on the ceiling of a church. Basque hands in a dark time, they said. People who'd once worn uniforms under a flag that burned and would now rather carry strangers than bend a knee again. The Gernika men had not forgotten the fire that ate their town's name. The ones in the 13th Demi-Brigade still wore the Legion's silence like armour. These would be the kind to point at snow and say this way when the night was loud with dogs, if they were real. If the rout was not a story told to make men braver. If. Too many ifs. The lane coughed him into a tangle of wash lines and dripping gutters. Overhead the rain quickened. He kept moving. A church bell tolled the hour and he counted without meaning to, because that's what operators do, count the seconds between signal and reply. A man stepped from a doorway with a walking stick and a calm face. Pilgrim felt it in his bones before he saw the eyes. Wrong calm. A quiet that didn't belong in rain. The walking stick came up. It wasn't a stick. Pilgrim went low, and the blow cracked the lintel behind him. He drove his shoulder into the man's belly and felt the breath go. The knot stick fell. It was a short cosh wrapped in leather. He took it and moved on. Somewhere down the lane a woman yelped, then stifled it. Doors knew when to close in this part of town. He hit the canal path and kept to the grass where footsteps don't carry. The terrier's voice floated across the water, not words, just shape. An order that became motion in other men's hands. Pilgrim pictured a lean face lined by winter, a mouth that rarely smiled. A terrier's focus: get close, worry the seam until something gives, never let go. The canal path threw him into a yard studded with barrels. He darted between them, took the far gate, and came out on a road where a tram slept under rain. The power arm ticked as drops hit the wire. He climbed the rear step, crouched, rode it for the length of the block, then dropped when he saw the checkpoint lanterns flicker ahead, sideways again. Always sideways. An archway offered shadow and a stink of yeast. The brewery yard beyond hissed with rain on copper. A boy in a cap looked up from a handcart and froze. Pilgrim put a finger to his lips and the boy's eyes flicked past him to the street. Those eyes widened. Someone was there. The boy jerked his chin the other way and Pilgrim obeyed. He slid behind a vat and hugged iron, willing himself to become shadow. Boots entered the yard, then another set, then silence. A match flared, a cigarette drew hot, and ash tapped on stone. The men left. The boy didn't move. Neither did Pilgrim. Only when the boy finally breathed again did Pilgrim exhale. "Merci," he whispered. The boy shook his head once. "Pas ici." "Not here." He tapped the cart's false bottom. Pilgrim lifted. The space smelled of hops and old rope. He slid in. The lid dropped. Darkness, rain thudding on wood, wheel grumble, his own pulse louder than the street. 10 minutes or 10 years later, the cart stopped. The lid lifted. A woman's face looked down, a line of soot across her brow, hair in a scarf. Not the boy's mother. Not anyone he knew. She jerked her thumb. Out. He rolled from the cart into a tannery where hides hung like flags of another country. The air was thick and sour. It hit the back of his throat and set it to flame. The woman pointed without speaking. A door behind the salt barrels. He went. Beyond the door, a narrow room, a stove, 2 chairs, a crucifix. On the table, a folded paper. He unfolded it and read it by the stove's light because the rain had made his hands shake and the light was all his. The note was 4 words, written in a firm hand. "Follow my Alan. Trust Iker." He closed his eyes and the coal in his head flared. Names, dates, rails. A timetable he dared not key. The Terrier was in the city, and the city itself seemed to tilt toward him like a roof shedding water toward a drain. He drew breath and set the paper back where it had been. The door eased. A figure entered softly, a woman in a waxed coat, raindrops ticking off the brim of her hat. She was younger than he'd imagined, and older than he'd hoped, eyes that had read too much, hands that had carried more than paper. "Pilgrim?" she said, voice low. He nodded. "I am my Alan," she said. "You won't remember my face or my name later. That is good. We go now." He hesitated, thoughts skittering to the boy in the brewery yard, the woman with soot on her brow, Mrs. Arnaud who had not knocked in her old rhythm, and the man at the door whose patience felt like a cold room. They will kill them for me, he thought, and the thought put a taste in his mouth like coins. My Alan's eyes seemed to answer a question he hadn't asked. "We are not brave because we want to be," she said simply. "We are brave because the night is here." Outside a tram bell clanged once and the rain slackened as if the sky had run out of tears. Somewhere east, the river shouldered its way past the docks. Somewhere west, the mountains waited under cloud, their name long and difficult in his mother tongue, but simple in the mouth of those who lived at their feet. Pyrenees. The Terrier would follow. Of course he would. That was the shape of the man. Close the distance, worry the crack. Never sleep until the hand clenched on something that throbbed. Pilgrim tightened the waxed strap on his satchel, which now held nothing that mattered. Everything that mattered beat behind his eyes and inside his chest. "Sideways," he said, almost to himself. Myallen nodded once. "Then sideways it is." They stepped into the lane, into the thin seam between two patrol routes, and let the night close over their shoulders like a cloak.
Chapter 2. The Net Tightens.
Rain stitched the lane into a single grey thread, and Myallen moved along it like someone who had read the pattern long ago. Pilgrim followed one pace back, steps placed where hers had already pressed the water thin. He kept his hands low, his head lower. Windows had a way of growing eyes when men in black coats passed. They cut through a court where gutters coughed themselves empty and into a tannery yard full of hides and hooks. Steam bled from a vent like a ghost that didn't want to be seen. Myallen rapped twice on a door, once on the lintel. It opened just wide enough to let in a rumour. Inside, a stove ticked, and the smell of lime and salt hit like a gloved slap. A girl waited by the table. 17, maybe. Cap pulled low, plate tucked down her collar. She held out a folded card with the same gravity as someone offering a saint. "Name for tonight," she said in a soft Basque accent. "Arnau, Matthew." She tapped Pilgrim's chest, then her own. "And I am your niece, Lorea. Uncle and niece. We will argue about stockings and the price of onions if anyone asks. You do not speak unless spoken to. You are going to Bayonne to fix a friend's bicycle." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "It is always bicycles." "Lorea," Myallen said, as if tucking the name into Pilgrim's coat. "She will take you to the night train. At the station you will not look at uniforms. You will look only at the floor and her shoes. Understand?" Pilgrim nodded. He wanted to tell the girl to go home, that a life should have lighter things in it than forged ink and lies said to men who carried pistols. But the words would only weigh them all down. He took the card and read the name that wasn't his. The letters wavered in the stove heat. He felt the coal in his head flare, a timetable, a gap the enemy had not seen in their own teeth, a thing too bright to risk on air. If the Terrier caught him, the light would go out and take 100 lives into the dark with it. Myallen saw something move behind his eyes. "You are not the only one carrying something," she said. "None of us are empty." Then, more briskly, "Go. The window is closing." The girl, Lorea, handed him a scarf and a flat cap that smelled of wool and someone else's sweat. "Wear these." She stepped close, tied the scarf, and when her fingers brushed his jaw, a flash of childhood shyness crossed her face and was gone. "Uncle," she said, testing the word for fit. "Lorea," he answered, and made it sound like a name he had said 100 times without thought. They went back into rain. The city had put on its night mask, blackout curtains, slit lights, a siren far away calling to no one in particular. Lorea kept her hand tucked under his arm like she'd been doing it all her life. "You will walk like an uncle," she murmured. "Old boots, old knees, not a stag, a donkey." He changed his gait. The trick wasn't speed now, it was sway. They crossed a boulevard where an officer smoked under a tree and pretended not to look at the clock. Pilgrim kept his eyes down. Lorea chattered about stockings and onions in a way that cut a path through air like a plough. At a corner, she stopped without warning, turned to him and slapped him lightly, twice. The sound was small but decisive. "For the story," she said. "We have argued." He blinked. "What about?" he asked before he could stop himself. "About a boy," she said. "There is always a boy." She straightened his scarf with careful fingers and moved on. The station was a mouth full of smoke and hurrying. Uniforms swam through the crowd like dark fish. A board clicked destinations with a dry-boned chatter. Pilgrim caught Bayonne and pretended he hadn't. Lorea dragged him to a ticket window and scolded the man behind it about delays and damp seats with such everyday fury that he handed over 2 tickets and a scrap of dignity without quite knowing what he'd lost. On the platform, steam lay in drifts like ground fog. The train breathed. Lorea steered him to the third carriage, second compartment, sat him by the window, and tucked the tickets into the leather of his cap. "If anyone asks," she said, "you fix things. You always fix things. You read the timetables for fun. You like the smell of oil." She slid a paper into his hand. "A catalogue, if they want you to prove it." He glanced down and read the first line to anchor himself. Grains, pièces, bouillon, seeds, parts, bolts. The pages were thick, the ink crisp. It was a silly kind of protection, and therefore perfect. He felt almost human with it between his fingers. The whistle blew. Doors slammed. Lorea didn't move. She took his left hand and traced the lines as if she could read the life in them. "If I am pulled off," she said calmly, "you don't stand. You don't look. You are the donkey with bad knees." He wanted to tell her he wouldn't let that happen. He didn't, because words like that had a way of turning to glass and cutting everyone who touched them. The train lurched. Rain became streaks. The station slid backward into memory. For 5 breaths there was only motion and the sound of wheels hammering a seam in the world. Then the compartment door opened. 2 feldgendarmerie in leather coats, faces like the same coin struck twice. Behind them a third man stood in the corridor, not looking in, not needing to. He had a narrow face and a patience that made the air colder. He spoke without speaking. The Terrier. Papers. The word fell into the compartment like a stone into a bucket. Lorea got there before Pilgrim. She spilled the tickets, the forged card, the catalogue, a handful of coins that rolled and clinked under the other seats. She sighed, exasperated, the way only nieces can. "Uncle," she said, and the word contained the tiny scold of 1,000 winter dinners. "Always you make a mess." The nearer feldgendarme took the card and the tickets. The other stooped to pick up the coins. Pilgrim kept his eyes on the floor and let his mouth flatten into a line. Knees, he reminded himself. Donkey knees. He rubbed one as if it hurt. The man in the corridor, the Terrier, shifted a fraction, as if scenting. Pilgrim felt that attention, thin and unerring, run over him like a wire strung tight. The Terrier's gaze slid on, moved to the next compartment. A dog passed in the hall, paws whispering on linoleum. The first feldgendarme sniffed the catalogue and smirked. "Bicycle man," he said in French. "You fix things?" Pilgrim let his head bob once, old and tired. "Fix my watch," the man said, enjoying himself. He held it out. It was already ticking. Pilgrim took it, turned it over, opened the back with a fingernail, and read the inscription, a name, a date, a town eaten by the front. He closed it, shook it twice, and held it to his ear. He nodded gravely and handed it back. "Now it will live longer," he said in a rough accent, words small and warmed by stove smoke. He didn't look up. The man chuckled. The other returned the coins to Lorea's open palm with the practised indifference of authority. Papers came back. The door slid shut. Lorea's fingers found Pilgrim's and squeezed once hard enough to hurt. "Don't relax," the squeeze said. "Not yet." The train picked up speed. Houses blurred into hedgerows. Hedgerows into open fields stewing under cloud. Lorea leaned her head against the glass and pretended to sleep. Pilgrim read the catalogue's parts lists until the letters stopped swimming. He timed the patrols by ear, the rubber soles, the jingle, the halt, the knock-knock, the slide, the breath, the door again. 4 carriages up, the pattern changed. A dog barked once. A voice flat, colder, asked something he couldn't hear. The Terrier again. The pattern repeated, moved closer. Lorea didn't open her eyes. "Between stations," she breathed. "The marsh. The train will slow where the track dips." "Will you?" He stopped. He had been about to ask if she would jump. "No," she said. "They have my face at the station and your face now." She smiled without moving her lips. "But I run slower. You cannot be found in my shadow." She slid something into his coat pocket. A different jacket, rolled tight as a loaf, patched elbows, new smell. "In the lavatory," she whispered. "Change, leave yours hanging. A man will help you fall." The Terrier's shadow reached their door. He didn't open it. He didn't have to. He stood. The dog stood. Pilgrim could feel a mind that had spent years in rooms with one chair and no windows, a mind that could wait out weather and men alike. The dog's claws ticked once on the metal lip. The train sang its long iron note. Then the note changed, a hollow under the wheels, a wet breath. Marsh. Lorea opened her eyes and laughed suddenly, loudly, like a girl who'd read a joke in a magazine. It was perfectly wrong for the moment, and that made it perfect. The feldgendarme 2 doors down glanced their way. The dog pricked its ears. For the length of one heartbeat, the world was misdirected. Pilgrim stood as if to stretch, grunted like a man with donkey knees, and drifted into the corridor. He went past the terrier without looking, carried along by his own age. The terrier's head turned a millimetre. Pilgrim felt it like cold on a tooth. He kept moving. The lavatory was a cupboard with a mirror that had given up. He locked the bolt, tore off his jacket, slid into the patched one, and hung his on the hook. In the pocket of the new coat was a railwayman's cap and a length of rough twine. He tied the twine into a loop and set the cap on his head. He opened the window. Wet, rush-scented wind hit him in the face. A knock. Not patrol. Softer. He slid the bolt. A man in a grease-stained vest, eyes like river stones, filled the doorway, turned without a word, and led Pilgrim down the narrow service corridor between carriages. The train swayed. The marsh slid by, slow, sullen, water in black sheets. The man kicked a little latch with his boot, a panel swung. Cold exploded into the gap. "You fall into reeds," the man said. "You sink a little. You will want to shout. Don't. Someone in the reeds will pull you. If no one pulls you, you crawl until the ground turns from song to silence." He looked at Pilgrim as if trying to read the thing inside him that made all this worth it. Whatever he saw, he nodded once. Now. Pilgrim set one boot on the iron lip, the other on nothing, and felt the wet air hold him up for a half-second like a liar's promise. He let go. The marsh rose and slapped him sidewise, cold to the bone, foul and full of old plant breath. Reeds took his arms with 1,000 wet hands. He went under, came up, gulped mud and sky, and something that tasted like pennies. A hand caught his collar and dragged him toward a pocket of darker dark. Another hand took his wrist and twisted it in a way that meant, "Don't fight." He didn't. The reeds closed over them. The train receded, a metal animal amazed to find itself suddenly lighter. Breath frothed in his throat. The hands dropped him into a low trench that smelled of peat and patience. A hooded figure crouched beside him. "No words," a voice said, "only hands." Those hands pressed a dripping reed mat over him, tucked him into the marsh like a secret into a wall. He lay still, the water a winter blade along his spine, and let his heart slow. Voices came along the berm. Flashlight combed the reeds. A dog splashed, snorted, whined, wanted. Another voice, flat, patient, said a single word that could have been again or closer or deeper. The terrier. The dog turned. The light moved. Boots carried the hunt further along the cut. Pilgrim breathed in mud, out fear. If they find the girl, the thought had edges. He bled on it in his mind and let it go because to hold it was to die by inches. The hooded figure's hand tapped once on his shoulder. Up. They rose together, reeds whispering. The figure pulled back the hood. A man with a thin mountain face and eyes the colour of old bark. "I am Ika," he said, voice almost lost in wind. "You will not remember my face or my name later. That is good. We go now south toward Bayonne, and then the Pyrenees." "Loria?" Pilgrim asked before the rule could catch the word. Ika's mouth tightened, then softened. "She is smoke," he said. "We are wind." He gave Pilgrim a stick. "Walk like a shepherd. Donkeys. Old knees." They moved through the marsh along a path that was more memory than ground, reeds parting and closing behind them. On the road above, an engine grumbled. Somewhere out there, the terrier turned his face to the wet and scented a direction. "Sideways," Pilgrim whispered. Ika smiled without showing teeth. "Always sideways," he agreed, until up. He tipped his chin toward the black shape of hills that waited beyond the last line of trees. Up is where men like him cannot use trucks. The rain thinned. In the east, a seam of lighter grey suggested a morning that hadn't decided if it wanted to live. They went toward it, toward Bayonne's sleeping edges, toward the first door of the Basque road, with the marsh water licking at their boots, and the world narrowing to footfalls and breath.
Chapter 3. The Basque Doorway.
Bayonne's edge rose from the marsh like a promise, then like a test. Warehouses hunched along the Adour, their brick faces wet with river breath. Nets hung like tired cobwebs. Salt, fish, tar. Ika took Pilgrim through the smell as if walking through old music, every turn a note he had read 100 times. They ducked under a rattling shutter and into a shed where the dark had a grain to it. Mayalen stepped out of that dark with a towel and a look that checked Pilgrim for holes without touching him. "You fell well," she said. "I sank badly," he answered, voice raw with marsh. That is how men are born here, Iker said, easing the door shut. We learn to walk later. Mylan pushed a chipped mug into Pilgrim's hands. Onion and heat. Sip. She turned to Iker. Dockside? Iker tipped his head. They were there. He was there? Pilgrim asked. He didn't say the name. Names had a way of making rooms colder. Iker didn't say it either. He was there, he agreed. He speaks softly. Men listen too hard. He looked at Pilgrim's coat, at the patch of marsh stain over the heart. His eyes softened for a breath, then cooled. Tonight we walk as long as there is city. We sleep when there is hill. Myallen unrolled a bundle onto a workbench. Paper, seals, ink pads, the careful lies of survival. Your face is different now, she said. Wet and small cuts. Good. This is you for the road. She held up a pass and a ration card. The ink carried a tired prefecture stamp with just enough smudge to be true. Matthew Arnaud, tinsmith, headed to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port for roofing work. People will hate that. Roofing always makes a man unwelcome in rain, but it is better than love. Where did Laurea go? The question escaped before Pilgrim could bar it. Myallen slid him a glance as sharp as a fish knife. She did what she was supposed to do. Will they? She read the timings and the doorways, Myallen said, and in her voice was a lifeline yanked out of cold water, brisk, unyielding, necessary. You will think of the road, not the ones behind you. You will respect their gift by living. Pilgrim nodded. The coal in his skull flared. Columns, sidings, a brief weakness in the occupier's jaw. If he went dark, the coal went dead. The Terrier, he said, because superstition didn't change the shape of a hunt. He knew the train. He knows everything trains know, said Iker. But trains obey tracks. We do not. A door opened on the far side of the shed, and 3 figures came in with the weather. 2 men in fishermen's coats and a woman in a black dress under a wool cape. The woman's hair held silver like cold light. She traced a small cross at her lips and touched Pilgrim's arm with 2 fingers as if counting a pulse. Amaya, she said, I keep house when houses have no roof. Her Basque accent folded the words into something older than the river. You pass through my kitchen like smoke. You leave nothing but warmth. She turned to the men. Unai, she said to the taller. Yokse, to the shorter. They will make your legs remember the mountain before the mountain has to carry you. The men nodded. They were cut from the same old wood as Iker, faces weathered into kindness by hard things. We build the road, Unai said, simple as a hammer. We tear it down after. We are not the only road, Joxy added. There are others, but ours is the one that moves when the map listens. Amaya's kitchen was the back room of a chapel that had once had money. A Lobaru Basque cross was carved into a beam blackened by decades of unregistered prayers. Pilgrim ate bread that cracked like ice and a soup that could make a dead man argue with his grave. He ate fast, then slower, because he was tired of racing even food. On the wall hung a photograph. Men in mismatched jackets, berets pulled low, eyes stubborn. A banner at their knees read, Gernika. Myallen caught his look. The battalion, she said. When the war finally coughs up its last shell, they will be remembered for what they did at the end, but their beginning was before that. In the fires, in the refusals. Some of them help here now as men without patches or parades. I thought they fought at the coast. Point de Grave, Pilgrim said, the facts rising from somewhere he'd read them and filed them as ballast. They did, Myallen said, and before and after. Here we borrow their bones. You will meet men who were at their side, and men whose brothers wore the chevrons of the 13th Demi-Brigade of the French Foreign Legion. The Legion men know how to disappear while moving forward. This helps when the ground is not France and not quite Spain, and the breath in your chest is a passport no one can stamp. Amaya's mouth tilted. The Legion also knows how to keep its mouth shut, because it learned that most men do not want the truth, only a story they can sleep beside. Pilgrim warmed his fingers around the bowl. The Terrier's shadow kept finding a way into the room. He tried to place it behind the Lobaru, under the table, inside his own ribs. He will question the docks, he said. He is questioning, Iker answered. Right now. Men familiar with rope and cold water. He asks the way you scrape a pot until the bottom shines. We put thicker stew on top tomorrow. What does he want from me? The question surprised Pilgrim because the answer should have been simple. He wanted him dead. But the Terrier's patience, his gaze that made distances feel like errors on paper, that wanted more. "He wants you to break yourself for him," Myelin said. "He wants to hold up the broken part and say, 'See, it always ends like this.' Men like him want endings they can read in advance. We will deny him that." A bell tolled somewhere near the river, not the hour, too slow, too sorrowed. Amaya's mouth moved in prayer without sound. Unai and Joxe stood. "We go," Unai said. They moved by twos through a maze of lanes that smelled of cod and old yarn. A man with a butcher's apron lifted his hand without looking at them, and for a moment Pilgrim felt the city itself was a kind of animal with a skin of doors and a spine of alleyways. When it trusted you, it let you inside. When it didn't, you bled out in the gutter while it watched the rain. At the docks, lamps drew islands of gold on black water. Men hunched in those islands, smoking coal-coloured cigarettes. A pair of Feldgendarmerie wandered with the bored sin of men who had already decided whom they would hurt to make the night go faster. Beyond them, in the lee of a crane, stood a man who could have been anyone until you noticed that he didn't shift his weight the way other men do. He simply owned the place he stood. The Terrier. His hat brim cut his face into fractions. He read the dock with his nose and his ears, not his eyes. Unai leaned to Pilgrim's ear. "If you must look at the ground past his boots. It is the only part of him that is safe." They crossed in a slow, unreproachable line. Joxe in front with a coil of rope, Myalin behind with a basket, Pilgrim between them carrying a dented toolbox that held nothing but folded clothes and a pair of nails. He dragged his left foot a little, donkey knees. The Terrier turned his head, the same millimetre Pilgrim had felt on the train, a small movement like a knife going from thought to intention. A gull screamed and dropped a shell onto the stones. It shattered like a small religion losing a war. The Terrier's attention tilted to the sound and then away, as if he'd filed the gull's habits for some future morning when the ledger had room for birds. They passed the crane. They passed the men with cigarettes and the water that read small and deep. Amaya waited at the end of the quay, by a door so narrow it could only lead to honesty. Inside, a stair turned twice, then again, up to a room cut out of the old city's shoulder. A stove, a rope bed, a window with a slice of river, a child's wooden horse on the sill. Amaya lifted it, and the sill lifted with it, a box beneath. She set the horse back gently, as if the child's ghost might ask where it had gone. From the box she took a map. It was hand-drawn, the ink tight and sure, each contour a vein. The high passes were marked with dots. Beside 3 of the dots were short names: Axoria, Laroun, Ispegui. She tapped the lowest. "This first," she said. Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, the old Pilgrim's Road. We will not walk the way they walked, that is watched. But the land is the same land, and the men who own it do not live in offices. She placed a second sheet over the first, roots in a different hand, bends and markers only a mouth would know how to speak. "These are smugglers' paths," Myelin said. "Salt, tobacco, men. They do not change because paperwork does. Basque to Basque, stone to stone." Joxe leaned over and with a carpenter's pencil put an X near the river bend west of town. "Checkpoint moved here," he said, 2 days ago. Unai added a small triangle near a shepherd's hut. "Dog with a broken ear," he said. "It bites right, not left." Ika drew a short slash across a gorge. "Fallen tree. We use it. Others don't. Too narrow for a man who sleeps well." Pilgrim watched the map grow a skin of knowledge only lived days can write. He felt the room press in, not in threat, but in purpose, and in that purpose lived all the faces passing through him tonight. Lorea at the window of the train, the boy with the brewery cart, the woman with soot across her brow, the men who held down the marsh as if it would float away without their hands. Myalin looked at the window's thin river and then at Pilgrim. "What you carry," she said, "I do not want to know. But I want you to know what we carry. My brother was with the 13th Demi-Brigade. He went where the Legion goes, where there is noise and no promises. He taught me how to hold my breath until the man who is hunting you decides air is for other people. The men in Gernika taught me to write names on wood and put the wood away and fight as if the names had never existed." She touched the lauburu etched on the beam with fingertips that had cooked for men who didn't have names anymore. "We will get you to Spain. Not because you are special, but because the road is." Down in the street a whistle blew once, short. A reply came, thinner, further away. Ika folded the maps and slid them into oilcloth. "It is time." Amaya pressed a packet into Pilgrim's hand. Bread, cheese, a small knife, a tiny tin with something that smelled like courage if courage had a recipe. "For when your mouth is just teeth," she said. They went down the stair and out by another door that didn't know it was a door. Rain petaled off the eaves and ran down Pilgrim's collar. They moved like a tide at slack water, making no sound that wanted to last. In the next street, a lorry coughed into life. In the next, a voice tried on anger and kept it. At the quay's end, the Terrier and a dockman stood under the crane's arm, as if it were a gallows that had changed careers. The dockman's cap sat wrong, spun by a hand that hadn't had time to be brave. The Terrier's mouth moved once. The dockman answered with his shoulder. The Terrier took his chin between finger and thumb, not pitiless, not cruel, only exact, and turned the dockman's face to the lamp like a page being read aloud. "Sideways," Ika breathed. They went sideways into a lane that didn't exist to anyone who wasn't born inside it. They crossed a rigging yard like men in a memory. They slipped through a coach house where a horse stamped twice and settled. Past the last shutter, past the last rope, the city stopped arguing and let the country begin. A hedgerow that read all the winds leaned over a narrow road. The road wandered past a stone virgin whose face had suffered weather without complaint, and then into dark that smelled of earth sure of itself. Ika pointed to a hill that kept its own counsel. "St. John before dawn," he said, "then the first rung of the ladder." "And after?" Pilgrim asked. "After," Mylan said, "we climb until even the dogs think twice." "The Terrier?" Pilgrim asked, because some fears must be named to be given their due. Ika's eyes gleamed without light. "He will come. He is a man who finds the seam and worries it until it gives. But stone has seams, and stone remembers." Pilgrim touched the oilcloth map through his coat, then the packet Amaya had given him, and last the place behind his eyes where the coal burned. The road ahead lengthened and narrowed, both at once. "Pyrenees," he whispered, testing the word the way a smith tests metal heat. Myalin heard and smiled with the left corner of her mouth. "You say it like someone who hasn't lost to it yet," she said. "Good. Keep that for a day. Then we will teach you how to lose properly and still arrive." They walked. The city fell behind without a sound, as if it had been holding its breath until they left and could finally let it go. Somewhere at the docks, a man with a patient mouth and a terrier's focus turned from a lamp and sniffed rain that had been touched by the same boots, the same wool, the same small packet of food. He began to move in that direction, not quickly. Men who have never been out of breath do not rush. The road narrowed to a sheep track. The sheep track broke into two, and then into one again when the hedge decided. Night settled into its own shape. The lamps of Bayonne became a handful of coins behind them. Ahead, a darker dark was folded upon itself like a sleeping animal. "The doorway," Ika said, almost kindly. "Put your hand on the jamb as you pass." Pilgrim brushed his palm against an old oak as they slipped by, and for a moment it felt as if the tree lifted something from him that he had not known he was carrying. Then the hill took his breath, the lane tilted upward, and the long climb began.
Chapter 4. False Trails.
They reached Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port at the smear of dawn when stone forgets its colour and bells forget their hour. The old gate, Port Saint-Jacques, held the slope like a hand that had never dropped anything it cared to keep. Pilgrim felt the climb in his calves and the coal in his head glow hotter with every step. Columns, sidings, a gap in the occupier's jaw. The secret was a live coal. If he stumbled, it would burn the road behind him clean. Myalin stopped short of the gate and let the morning red them first. The streets were wet, the cobbles shining like fish scales. A mule snorted under a burlap load. A shop girl in a shawl swept last night out her door and into the gutter as if the night would go quietly when asked. "Someone sells today," Mylan murmured, eyes on the angle of shutters. "Someone watches for the price." "Your net?" Pilgrim asked. "Our town," she corrected. "Town is better than nets. Nets break." Ika ghosted out of a side passage, rain in the seams of his coat. He held up 2 fingers and pointed with his chin. Tobacco shop on the corner, curtain too neat for a morning, cafe beyond, 2 hats too dry for a wet day, and farther on at the arch where pilgrims used to count their sins before they counted their steps, a uniform that had been told to look bored and wasn't very good at it. Half the hour, Ika said. He's behind for now. He meant the Terrier without needing to say the name. We flush, Myallen decided. How? Pilgrim asked, already bracing. As if you were caught, she said, as if talking to a nervous horse. Men who sell their neighbours cannot resist being first to tell the buyer where the bargain is. She tugged a strip of black leather from her pocket, 2 cuff loops joined by a sliding knot. You will wear these like shame, she said, and tightened them around Pilgrim's wrists. The knot was clever. A twist would free him in a breath. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. You walk as if this hurts your pride more than your bones. You do not run. I do not like this, Ika said mildly, which meant he hated it. Neither do I, Myallen answered. That's why it will work. They moved into town down the Rue d'Espagne, Myallen's hand hard on Pilgrim's elbow, her voice sharp enough to cut daytime from night. Black market thief, she snapped in French, and in the stall shadows heads lifted like birds. Roofing lies, you sell tin for bread and then take bread back. She performed anger like a born actress, throwing shards of it under the cafe awning and across the tobacco shop's smeared glass. The 2 dry hats turned to watch, trying not to. The curtain in the tobacco shop twitched. A boy, the baker's odd son, Ika's glance said, ran ahead, then trotted alongside them with a dog's curious trot. Pilgrim kept his face hot, his eyes down, his wrists up. The cuffs bit just enough to write truth on his skin. The part of him that wanted to break and run was the same part that would get him killed. He gave it no letter to work with. They reached the square where the church sat with its stone lip on the morning. Myallen turned him to the steps, drove him up them, and banged the heavy door open with her shoulder. "Father!" she called, the anger still in her voice but repurposed, like a knife flipped to its flat to open a parcel. "A soul that needs quiet." A priest appeared from the dark like a man sculpted by the same hands that made the door, broad, patient, older than the city, black hair with a line of white like frost. "Aita Zabier," he said, as if introducing the office to a friend. He took in Pilgrim's hands, then Myallen's face, then the hats under the cafe awning, the curtain across the way, the uniform beyond the arch. It took him as long as it takes a bell to change its mind about ringing. "This way," he said, and gave Pilgrim a look that was both instruction and absolution. Debts later. They crossed the nave's chill, their footfalls swallowed by centuries. The smell of wax and stone and something older, basin water, palm ash. Aita Zabier led them to a narrow door near the transept, up a corkscrew stair barely wide enough for breath, then into the belfry where pigeons dream of a world without roofs. He set Pilgrim behind the louvered slats, the town laid out like a low map, the tobacco curtain, the cafe hats, the uniform pretending not to tilt. "Hands?" the priest asked. Myallen showed him the knot. He snorted softly, impressed despite himself, and freed Pilgrim with a flick. "Ring if you must," Aita Zabier said, resting a palm on the cold bell. "Once for fire, twice for flood, 3 for dog and men. We will cut that rope before we give them the habit." Myallen touched the priest's sleeve. "Half an hour," she said. "He is that today." The priest's eyes cooled. "Then we have 25 minutes to make him angry and 5 to make him wrong." He crossed himself fast, as if the sign were far more practical than mystical. "Go." Myallen left, the stare tightening her breath into a coil. Ika did not follow her. "Supplies," he said to Pilgrim. "Stay until the bell tells you who you are." He slipped into the dark like a coin into a pocket. Pilgrim watched through the slats. The curtain in the tobacco shop lifted an inch. A woman's face, pinched and pale, her thumb worrying a rosary like a debt. She leaned toward the square and whispered to someone behind her. The baker's odd son ran again, to the arch, to the uniform, breath-puffing. One of the cafe hats stood and tried on a purpose. The other forgot to finish his drink. The square shifted weight. The game had been announced to anyone who needed a game. "I am bait," Pilgrim thought, and laughter tried to stand up in his chest. He pressed it down. It was a dangerous companion. He thought of Lorea's hand on his, the brewery boy's stillness, the soot-browed woman's casual courage. He thought of the coal. The bell overhead breathed the cold into his scalp. He closed his eyes and let a prayer bow itself inside him and then stand again. Footsteps at the arch. Not the bored uniform now. A man who made bored men stand straighter by existing. Hat brim, narrow face, stillness that owned space. The Terrier. He did not enter the square like a man, he arrived like weather. Pilgrim felt the air change. In the cafe, the hat that had tried on purpose took it off again. The tobacco curtain closed, its owner read the wisdom of walls. The baker's odd son tugged at the terrier's sleeve and pointed and stammered joy into the man's patience. The terrier listened to the boy with the deep attention most men reserve for lawyers and surgeons. Then he touched the boy's head in a gesture that was not kindness but something colder. The boy lit up as if it had been a blessing. The terrier stepped into the square and did not look at the church. He did not look at anything first. He smelled the air, tasted the morning, weighed the slope. Then he looked at the steps and at the scuffs where Myalen's boot had slipped on wet stone. He knelt and pressed 2 fingers to the wet. He knew rain. He knew hurried. He knew how long water takes to forget a shoe. Pilgrim's heart steadied. Half an hour, he thought. He is half the hour. Ita Zabier came back up the stair with a bundle wrapped in coarse cloth. He laid it out with altar reverence, rope coiled small, a length of hemp with knots burned in, 2 pairs of alpargatas, Basque rope-soled shoes for moving quiet, a pair of short crampons that would bite crust when the slope turned treacherous, a tin of lamp-black to deaden shine, a phial of anise oil, a cloth pouch of ground coffee and pepper mixed. For dogs, he said, for men who use dogs. And for men who use men, Pilgrim said, eyes on the square where the terrier drew a small circle with his heel, as if marking the place where certainty would stand later. Ita Zabier's mouth bent. Those men are dogs that taught themselves to read. Below, Myalen reappeared at the far end of the square with Unai and Joxy carrying a crate between them. A municipal crate, the kind town hall men loved because it was heavy with nothing. Myalen's voice ran ahead of them, complaining about fees, about permits, about a world where one could not carry a box without a signature. It was performance, yes, but it was also truth of a kind, and towns read truth. The tobacco curtain twitched again. The cafe hat who had sat stood, tried once more to summon purpose, and found it this time. He walked toward a side alley, head down, as if his feet had discovered a secret he wasn't yet sure he should share. Ita Zabier leaned to the bell rope and gave it a tiny shake, enough to make the clapper kiss metal. A note, shy, tested the air. The terrier's head tilted exactly 1 degree. He looked up. For one long blink, Pilgrim was certain the man could see through stone and slats and into the precise line of his gaze. The terrier didn't come in. Patience has thresholds. He set his men spinning in slow orbits that brushed the market, the arch, the alley. One orbiter clipped Myalen's argument and rebounded, frowning at being turned into a child in public. Another paused at the tobacco shop, and before the woman could smooth her curtain, her face was a page in a book the man knew by heart. The bell rope twitched again, 2 soft kisses, flood. Ita Zabier smiled, a winter expression that had a little summer left. Old code, he murmured, for old ears. Pilgrim watched the alley as if watching counted as work. The cafe hat disappeared into it. Unai and Joxy let their crate tilt, spilling nothing on purpose, and blocked the alley mouth for 2 heartbeats. When they lifted it, the hat was gone. Joxy's cousin, Ita Zabier said. He will tell the next door on our chain that today is a dog day. Doors close different. The terrier moved again, always half an hour, always as if time were a leash he could cut if it disobeyed. He paused at a notice board under a flaking scallop shell, the old Pilgrim sign, and read the permits with the same patience he gave men. Pilgrim's throat tightened. He had once loved notice boards for their blank municipal confidence. Now they looked like altars men had built to the idea that everything can be measured if you put enough lines on paper. A knock on the belfry door. Acre, damp with new weather. He laid down another bundle, canvas gaiters, a shepherd's cloak that could be a rock if you told it to, 2 wooden blocks carved like goat hooves with leather straps to fit over boots. For prints, he said. We will become the goat when the hill asks. And the false road? Myalen asked from the stair mouth, cheeks flushed with argument, eyes bright with mischief and something like sorrow. Ika's mouth twitched. Amaya has your old jacket pegged to a laundry line by the west gate, he said to Pilgrim. A boy who looks like you from behind will take a bus east wearing another like it. Unai left one of your caps under the bench at the tannery. Joxe bought 2 tickets for the noon coach to Pau, and asked loud why thieves always go to Pau. The Terrier will write all this down in his head, and then tear the page out. Aita Jabier uncorked the anise. The bell chamber filled with a clean sweetness that made Pilgrim think of childhood, and then hate himself for the luxury. The priest dabbed the oil at the threshold and the stair and the sill, and then shook the coffee pepper mix in a thin line where the pigeons roosted, and where no pigeon would ever think to sit again. "We leave the nose a story," he said. "Not a lie. A story." Myallen tightened Pilgrim's scarf and tugged his cap down. "Ready?" she asked. He looked at the square one last time. The Terrier stood with one hand on the notice board, and in that moment Pilgrim understood the man's true patience. He didn't mind being angry if anger taught him something. His eyes passed over the church again, not hungry, not hurried, and Pilgrim felt the weight of his own future in that lack of appetite. He will come when the hill stops being a church and becomes stone, Pilgrim thought, and then we will need new prayers. "Ready," he said. They left the bell to its pigeons and slid down the stair. Aita Jabier pressed a small scapular into Pilgrim's palm. "Not for faith," he said. "For touch. Men need a something in the pocket when the pocket is full of nothing." They went out a side door that wasn't a door, across a cloister that didn't own up to being a cloister, and into a lane that had been there before maps. Myallen dropped a rag that smelled of anise into a puddle, then kicked water wide with a child's enthusiasm. Ika walked the edge of the lane where rain writes nothing. Pilgrim kept to the centre like a donkey with old knees. Behind them, the square folded itself back into morning. Ahead, the street narrowed until it was a thought the town had forgotten to finish. A stone virgin watched them pass without judgment. Beyond her, the first farm track tilted toward the low hills. The wind changed. River to sheep, town to earth. Unai and Joxe were already there, the crate gone, their hands empty of anything a man could use to arrest them. "Now the country," Ika said simply. "And the dogs?" Pilgrim asked. Myallen smiled her left-corner smile. "We left them a book to read," she said. "By the time they finish the first page, we will be on the second mountain." "The Terrier?" Pilgrim asked, because some names belong in every chapter of a man's day. "Half the hour," Ika said. "Always, until the hill takes the hour away." They stepped out of town as the church bell gave the hour it owed the morning. 1 chime late, 2 chimes honest, 3 chimes for dog and men, soft, swallowed quickly. The road rose. The roofs fell behind. The Pyrenees were not yet mountains, but they had begun to speak in the grammar of stone. Pilgrim touched the scapular in his pocket and the coal behind his eyes in the same small gesture. Sideways until up, he told himself. Up until over.
Chapter 5. Into the foothills.
The road pinched down to a sheep track and then to a thought the hedge hadn't finished. Mud took their ankles. Wind came down off the low ridges, smelling of wet wool and old iron. Behind them, the bell of Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port tried the hour again, late on purpose, and Pilgrim let the sound fall out of his ears. What mattered was the ground ahead, and the breath he could borrow from it. Ika set a rhythm that wasn't fast, only relentless. Step, place, breathe. Step, place, breathe. Myallen took the rear, not watching Pilgrim so much as the world behind him. Unai and Joxe moved in a staggered pattern off the track, one higher in broom and gorse, one lower near the wall. It was the way men walk when they expect fields to have eyes. Pilgrim carried the coal in his skull like a lamp hidden in his chest. Columns on the move, a timetable of the occupier's teeth shifting in a predictable mouth, if he lived to speak it. If he died, the light went out with nothing left but stories, and a hole in a plan that would kill men he would never meet. He pushed the thought down where his stomach kept its acid. They passed a stone virgin at a fork. Her face had been rubbed smooth by hands and weather until she held nothing but patience. Myallen brushed a finger against the base, an old habit, and then filled the track with talk that would be nothing to anyone not born in it. "Dogs took a ewe on this path last winter," she said mildly. "I left an egg by the wall. It brought the ewe back in spring. Some things pay late." Ika paused at a stile and knelt. He dabbed the anise oil across the top rail, the post tops, the muddy puddle just beyond. Then he shook the coffee pepper mix low and right where a dog's nose would want to learn something. He didn't look proud of the trick. He looked sad that he needed any at all. "Dogs learn," he said. "That is their grace. Men who use dogs do not always. That is our grace." Pilgrim could feel the Terrier as a pressure in the weather, rather than a point on the map. Half an hour behind, probably less by now. He pictured the narrow face tipped to the wind, the way the man had read the dock by scent and angle instead of paper. There would be men with sticks on leashes out there, tramping the wet fields into patterns that meant everything has been touched. He kept his eyes forward and his feet honest. The track bled into open hillside where bracken lay flat from last year's snows and new green stabbed through with a stubbornness Pilgrim envied. Sheep bells clinked on some other slope, small notes in a chord of wind. Unai lifted a hand and cut left off the obvious line onto a seam of harder ground. He pointed at a scatter of stones, then at the sky. No words. Storm later. The stones knew before men did. A shepherd's hut crouched in a fold of the hill. Slate roof, one eye of a window, door held shut by a stone with more personality than the door. Ika nodded to it as they passed. "Ostatua," he said, "shelter." They didn't stop. The hut was exactly the sort of mercy a hunter will watch, because he would need mercy too if he were on the other side of the chase. Mercy makes men predictable. They kept moving. Pilgrim's thighs burned and his lungs worked like bellows that had seen a war of their own. In the places where the path steepened into steps, cut by centuries of weather and feet, he let his mind go narrow. Next stone, next breath, next place to put weight and not fall. He kept the coal tamped behind his eyes and thought of Lorea's quick fingers, the brewery boy's stillness, Amaya's laubaru burned into the chapel beam. "If I fall, I tear the road behind me," he told himself. Don't fall. They crossed a stream that talked to itself about being bigger someday. Ika had them walk up the bed for 30 paces, then out on the far bank using only rocks. He brushed Anis on both sides and let the water decide what story to carry. Unai looped back alone and dragged a thorn branch across their entry point, erasing the argument their boots had made. "Men read water wrong when they are angry," Myalyn said over her shoulder. "They think it tells them things that, when really it only speaks to the moon." The sky settled its jaw. Rain thickened, more determined. Wind leaned in. The land began to use a different grammar, heather and rock and the kind of grass that grows by holding on to itself. Joxy handed Pilgrim the goat hoof blocks and showed him how to strap them over his boots. "Not forever," he said. "Only where the mud is an author." They wore them along a soft saddle where a patrol would love to kneel and pretend to be hunters. The blocks wrote a short story about 4 stubborn goats headed upslope for no reason men could fathom. Then they took them off and stepped on stone for the next 100 paces to give the story an ending that didn't invite a sequel. Ika stopped under a hawthorn that had decided to be a gate. He raised 2 fingers and opened his hand. 5 minutes. He set Myalyn to face north, Unai south, Joxy east. Pilgrim took west, his ears working harder than his eyes. When all you have is breath, you learn to hear the slope's pulse. It said sheep, rain, a raven's wing, water under stone. It did not say men, not yet. Myalyn moved first, hand low, palm slicing, down. They crouched. Voices, thin with distance, rode the wind across the shoulder of the hill. Not German, too loose. Gendarmes or the local militia that liked to dress as if they had borrowed a uniform and a conscience together. Ika's fingers sketched a line on the air toward a stand of broom. They belly slid into it as if the hill wanted them, and the broom closed over them the way the marsh had. 3 men topped the rise and stopped to be bigger than they were. One smoked with his whole face. The other 2 tried to look like men who were owed something by the horizon. The smoker flicked ash and said something about a girl. The others laughed because men like them rarely know what else to do in the rain. They trudged on, boots beating sense into the mud and writing their own lie about having looked everywhere. When the men were gone, Pilgrim felt an acid tide come out of his bones and into his blood. They will hurt someone for me today, he thought, and the thought had teeth. He pictured the baker's odd son, and the woman behind the tobacco curtain, and Ita Zabier's hands on the bell rope. He pictured the terrier's small nod when a man did what he was told, and the way the cold in the man's patience made sweat break in other people's armpits. Keep moving, he told himself. Pay what you can pay later. They crested a low ridge, and the country opened like a book the weather had been writing for 1,000 years. Deep cleft valleys, old dudes and Basque, ran south like sentences that wanted to end in Spain, but hadn't yet found the right words. Peaks shouldered up black and sure where the rain had polished them. On a far slope a white chapel was nailed to the green like a prayer that refused to learn new language. 2 more hours, Ika said. Then we leave fields to men who like them and ask stone to be our friend. Will stone answer? Pilgrim asked. It always answers, Ika said. Sometimes with the truth you asked for, sometimes with the truth it prefers. They dropped into a beech wood where the trunks rose straight as rules and the leaves made a wide green room. The rain softened to a hiss held in the canopy. The ground was springy with last year's nouns. Ika's pace increased. The wood had corridors you could learn if you gave it 3 winters and a quiet mouth. He had both. At the far edge of the wood a ruin crouched, low walls, hearthstone, a beam like a broken tooth. Unai went in first and came out with his palm flat. No. Ika nodded and slid them past without stepping on the threshold. Men like to step there, he said, so men like him like to watch there. The Terrier? Pilgrim asked, though the answer had already arrived in his skin. Ika's mouth didn't move much. He is the sort who can stand for an hour in the rain, and only the rain gets tired, he said. We will let him stand where the view is good and the ground tells lies. They angled up a spur that felt like a staircase someone had built for a reason, and then decided to forget. Myallen hummed under her breath, an old tune that had to be older than the uniforms on the roads. It wasn't for comfort. It was for timing. If your feet keep time, your mind does not invent spare rhythms to trip over. The spur levelled into a shelf with a low stone wall, and beyond it a drop sudden enough to make the bottom of Pilgrim's lungs remember being young. Up the valley, 3 distant points of light moved where there shouldn't have been lights. They burned and died and burned again with a rhythm men use when they want to feel like they're in charge of life. Flares. Not near. Near enough to feel their arrogance through the rain. Half the hour, Myallen said, very soft. Less, Ika said. He learned something at the church. He is not angry about it yet. When he is, he will move faster. His anger is money. He spends it carefully. Ika pointed to a dark ribbon skipping down the far slope. We cross there, where the goats cross, not where men do. The men will think we are tired of being clever and choose the bridge. We will leave them that happiness. They made the crossing on a log that had failed at being a tree and succeeded at being a way. The water below spoke in a fast voice about rock and everything rock will not do, which is most things. Jokse hummed back to it like an uncle pretending to agree. On the far bank, Ika took them up through gorse that wrote essays on their shins, and over rock that would never admit it had been asked to help. Up ahead, a low, dark shape detached itself from a boulder and became a man when it decided they were close enough to be human. He wore a Legion greatcoat cut down to a civilian's honesty. The collar still had a ghost of a number on it, half picked away. He lifted his chin to Ika with the economy of men who have read the same bad weather. Gubby, Ika said. He bled with the 13th Demi-Brigade when the world thought the Legion was a story. Now he carries bread over lines that pretend not to be there. Gubby's eyes went from Pilgrim's boots to Pilgrim's mouth to Pilgrim's hands. He said nothing for a full 10 breaths, and in that silence Pilgrim felt inspected and, in a strange way, admitted. Finally, the man's mouth moved. We have snow higher, Gubby said. Crusted. A man who pretends to be strong will lose a knee. We will not pretend. He produced from his pack a pair of short crampons and a coil of thin rope. He showed Pilgrim how to lash the irons so the teeth would bite, but the straps would not sing. Quiet feet, he said. Stone likes men who do not brag. They climbed again, the shelf giving way to a slope that finally remembered it was a mountain's child. Wind came higher, colder, with a memory of ice in it. Pilgrim's breath became a metronome he set himself against. His mind narrowed until there was only the print of Ika's heel and the place his own toe should want next. Behind and below, a horn blew on the road they had left 2 valleys ago. A dog barked and then chose not to. Pilgrim looked back and saw nothing but rain stitched over distance. He pictured the Terrier standing at the white chapel with his hat brim cutting the world into manageable pieces. his men fanning out where the map told them to, his dog learning a book it had not read before. Half the hour, Pilgrim told himself. Make the hour longer. At a shoulder where the wind couldn't quite decide what to do, they ducked into another shepherd's hut. This one a true hole in the hill with a roof of turf and a doorstone that looked like it could tell stories if you fed it enough mutton fat. Ika pushed it too, not closed, never closed, because closed is something a patrol can read from the path. He motioned them to sit on the old sheep fleeces and passed a skin of water. Amaya's packet came out. Bread, cheese, the tiny tin with something that smelled like someone's grandmother telling the truth. Pilgrim chewed and felt human revive in him like a pilot light catching. Myallen took his hands without asking and rubbed his fingers hard until they flushed. You need them for more than keys, she said. Men forget their hands belong to their hearts. Garby stood at the doorstone, not looking out, listening. He is closer, he said simply. He has left men at the slow places. He will keep the quick for himself. Pilgrim swallowed and found the coal again. He could almost see the page he had refused to transmit, the thin line of numbers that would make sense to someone with the right map and the right appetite for risk. He pictured the faces of men who would live if that line landed in the right hands. He pictured the Gernika photograph in Amaya's kitchen. "We move," he said, surprising himself with the flatness in his voice. "We move," Ika agreed. He looked at Myallen. "You?" She shook her head once. "I turn back," she said. "There is a boy in St. John who will be asked too many questions if a woman does not argue with the men who ask them. Unai and Jokse will walk me as far as the door that isn't a door." She looked at Pilgrim as if memorizing him only to forget him properly later. "You will not thank me when you reach Spain," she said. "You will drink water and find a radio and speak your coal. That will be enough." He wanted to say her name. He didn't. He pressed her forearm once, a touch with a weather of its own, and then he stood because standing was the only prayer he believed in today. They went out into a world that had traded green for black and white, the line between them sketched by rock and intent. The slope above wore a rime where the wind had licked it. The path ahead drew thin toward a notch Gaby had called a col with his legion mouth and a different word with his older one. "Pyrenees begin here," Ika said, not as poetry, but as fact. "Everything before was the door. Now we walk on the threshold." Pilgrim set his foot where Ika's heel had blessed the stone and felt the mountain notice. He lifted his eyes once, briefly, toward the south, where Spain sat like a promise people had died to keep honest. And then he put his head down and climbed.
Chapter 6. Night of Crossings.
Night folded down like a hood, and the mountain changed languages. Wind stopped talking in sentences and started whispering names. Water forgot it was a stream and became a road for sound. Ika set a pace that wasn't fast, only exact. Gaby drifted to the flanks, a shadow with a memory. They climbed in darkness until the path thinned to a single wet seam on slate. Above them, clouds shredded on an edge of rock and let the moon look once, no more. The brief light gave them the next 10 steps. White rime on grass, black stone like wet bone, a kink in the ridge where a goat trail went not quite where a man would choose. Then cloud closed, and they went by hand and breath again. "Quiet feet," Gaby murmured, the legion still in his throat. "Stone remembers boots." They angled toward a small saddle where the wind bucked, then dropped into a high basin that cupped cold like a habit. Something moved, only sheep, but all 3 Basques stopped the same way men stop in a church when they feel the prayer start before the priest speaks. On the basin's far side, a dark band crossed the slope. Not a wall. Water. Ika crouched, touched frost, and lifted a finger to taste. "Behots," he said. Heart water. A braid of streams that gathered what the ridge refused to keep and then flung it downhill to men who thought rivers begin where maps say they do. "We cross without speaking," Myallen had told him at the last hut before turning back. Water carries words faster than boots. The first ford was a whisper over pebbles. The second was a slick of black glass under a skin of ice. The third wanted to be a lesson. Ika laid his staff across it, heel-toed the kelp-slick stones, and put Pilgrim's hand on the same places as if placing keys on a ring. Halfway, Pilgrim's left boot went blind. His heel slid. The cold lifted through leather like a threat. Garby's hand closed on his wrist with a strength that read as bone first and then as man. They didn't yank, they placed. The boot found purchase. Breath came back. On the far bank, Ika shook anise oil from the small bottle and drew a thin, invisible line that the water would carry downstream to dogs. He took a fingernail of Amaya's coffee pepper mix and flicked it into 2 eddies where noses would want to learn something. Careful, not too much. A dog should sneeze and doubt, not panic, and teach men to be cautious. They moved again, their world the width of the next decision. Pilgrim's legs ached in that good, clean way that comes when pain finally agrees to be work. His hands were stone cold, but honest. He kept the coal in his skull tamped and inside, columns shifting, a window of hours that would close if he failed to be a man-shaped answer to a question the British High Command hadn't even asked the right way yet. The first flare went up in the valley behind them like a false moon that hated trees. It bloomed, hung, died. Another answered from a different ridge, later, too late. The timing of men who want to look connected to the night, but are not yet on speaking terms with it. Ika's head tilted, counting. Roads, he whispered. And 1 shepherd's cart track. They don't know which way we read the wind. Pilgrim pictured the Terrier below, not looking up at the flares, never looking where he was told to, only watching the shadows move when the light insulted the dark. He would measure the men who fired and the men who waited and file away, which had patience and which had pride. Then he would move toward the seam between them, because that is where a terrier's teeth belong. Half the hour? Pilgrim asked, breath between words. Less, Ika said. He gave his anger a job. They came to a stone marker that might have been a boundary or a grave or a prayer left on a hill by someone who didn't have paper. A laburu had been cut into it, Basque cross, 4 commas chasing each other forever. Someone had rubbed it with fat in another winter so the grooves would keep their voice. Gabi touched the stone with his forefinger, and then his brow, a motion so small it could have been a tick. We pass, he said, not to the men but to the hill. A wind shift brought dogs, not sound, intent. Then the sound faint, far, the kind of bark that tries to sound like authority and almost gets there. Ika's hand went flat, ground. They eased into heather until they were the colour of the mountain. The dogs worked the lower basin, uncertain in cold water, more certain on turf. Lamp ghosts drifted behind them, lanterns cupped to hands, briefly bright, then hooded. Voices trained to travel were kept small. A shape paused where they had crossed. A handler cursed, the curse blew white. The dog sneezed 3 times sharp, shook its head, and started to lie to itself. Not here. Maybe there. The handler, more honest, knelt and put his face to the water the way men do who want to hear what stream beds say. He stood, undecided. A lamplight washed the stones near their exit point and skated off. Gabi's fingers found Pilgrim's sleeve and pressed once, steady. The dogs pulled away, offended by doubt. The men followed, obedient to their own tiredness and the lights on the road that promised rules and heat and someone else's problem. Ika waited until the wind read empty. Then he rose. "We leave a ghost," he said. "How?" Pilgrim asked. Gabi unrolled a rag, and there, nestled in it, were 2 old nailed soles barely wider than the palm of a hand. Kids, hobnails hammered into thin pine, curved to take a small boot. He strapped them to outside the goat hoof blocks with leather thong, wrong and right at once, and walked a dozen paces in soft ground across the slope, feet slightly pigeon-toed like a boy with too much growth and not enough school. He hopped once over a rock, dragged the right heel, and cut down toward the cart track where a patrol would feel bold. 13 steps, Ika said. No more. Gabi returned the way he'd gone, placing his boots into their old truth so the lie wouldn't grow a spine. He untied the little soles, wrapped them, and gave them back to their rag, and the rag back to the pack. "A ghost," he said. "Enough for a story, not enough for a hunt." They went on, and the mountain came closer the way night comes closer to men who are nearly done with the day. The ridge above them pulled itself tight into a notch, and all the wind in France seemed to decide to pass through that one place. Gabi's rope came out in a smooth coil. "Hands on," he said. "Never pull. Only ask." He tied Pilgrim in with 2 turns around the waist, a knot that would forgive a mistake once and then ask for better. The notch was a narrow V of black on black. The snow there had crusted and would bear a careful man and kill a proud one. Ika went first. The crampon points biting, the staff testing. Pilgrim followed the exact geometry of his heels, edge, edge, flat, edge, edge, flat. Wind tried to lever him off thought. He put his mind where his feet were and refused to move it until the next placement asked politely. Halfway across, a flare turned the world to sheet metal. Every edge went bright, every shadow a knife. Pilgrim felt the ridge in his teeth. The flare died, and the after-image went with it. The dark came back heavier. The rope tugged, twice patient, Gabi's signal for breathe more than move. Pilgrim did both, in that order. They finished the notch and stepped into a lee that felt like a chapel where the roof had fallen in, but the holiness stayed. Good, Ika said simply, and in his mouth the word meant much more. They struck a contour line behind a lip of rock, and the path there was the shade men mean when they say right under their noses. Ika made time. Gabi ghosted ahead and came back with a hand sign Pilgrim had not seen before, left hand open, right hand's first 2 fingers walking across it. Customs cut, he said aloud when they were under the shelter of a boulder. Old post. Sometimes a man sits there at night to remember getting paid for being useless. They slid to the cut one by one. The hut was only 3 stones high and a roof of tin. Inside, dust and a ledger swollen by damp. A bit of mirror nailed to a beam showed eyes and not much else. Pilgrim crouched and lifted the ledger. He leafed carefully past pages that had melted into each other. Names, loads, notes that were not notes. He found a column that still held shape and read it by the small lantern Gabi cupped from the wind. Axuria, Ispegi, Laroon. He put a finger under a line that showed a mule crossing 3 nights out of 7 in moon, fair or not. Below that, a tally of boots that did not belong to mules. They watch Axuria too much, he said, and Ispegi when the sky is mean. Laroon draws the proud because the view bribes them. Ika smiled, small. Good, we take the way that offers no story. He tapped a penciled squiggle, no name, just a shepherd's vanity. Aderan, he said, beautiful, but only if you are a goat. Gabi pinched out the lantern and set the ledger back skewed, the way it had been. Pilgrim slid the mirror down a nail's width, the way bored men do without knowing. Little signs for later, to make any hunter read, no one was here. They moved on with the night aging around them. Somewhere down slope, a single pistol shot popped flat, then 2, then men yelling the way men yell when their bravado meets cold and the cold does not care. Ika did not look that way. They shot at a fox and hit a log, he said. Now they will shoot at each other's stories. The next crossing was not water or snow, but stone, a boulder fan that wanted to roll truth out from under a boot. They went slow, 3 points of contact, rope slack but ready. Pilgrim's breath had a rattle in it now where the cold had set up a workshop. He coughed once and the mountain sent the sound back edited. He swallowed. The coal in his head pulsed, hours, wagons, sidings ready to be teeth in the enemy's mouth if only the right hand closed on the right lever at the right time. They will throw a net on the low passes at dawn, Gabi said, half to Ika, half to the wind. Leave trucks in the bottoms, men on the steps of the White Chapel. A dog at every ford tempts a fool to try the bridge. We will not be the fool, Ika said. We will be the small patience that the net was not tied to catch. The last ford of the night was a gorge pinched tight as a lie. The tree that made it crossable had fallen years ago, and then been persuaded by hands to stay fallen in just the right place. Ika went first, 1 hand on bark, 1 foot edging. Gabi followed, rope humming between them. Pilgrim set his boots where bark had learned to be smooth. Halfway, wind rose like a crowd in a theatre. The rope firmed. He angled into the gust, made himself a smaller problem for it to solve, and crossed. On the far side, a low altar waited, a rough stone with 3 smaller stones standing on it like teeth. Someone had left a fern there and a coin. Ika put down the goat blocks and the little nailed soles and touched the altar with the back of his fingers, as if to say we took nothing but weight and we leave that behind. Gabi set a tiny paper flag there, plain, no mark. Pilgrim watched him take it back after 1 breath and pocket it. It is enough to know we honoured, Gabi said. We don't give the man behind us letters to read. They climbed until night began to fray. A scrap of pale dragged at the eastern rim. The wind's teeth felt blunter. The snow in the hollows forgot to be ice and tried to be water again. The ridge ahead knifed southwest. a broken-backed thing that pointed at a country Pilgrim had not yet earned. Spain was there, a fact the mountain accepted reluctantly. They tucked into a bowl scooped out of the ridge and let their hearts slow. No fire. No talk. Bread, the last of the onion soup fat scraped with a fingertip from a Myers tin, a sip of cold that had once been courage. Gabi unrolled a blanket the colour of nothing and pulled it to his shoulders without ever looking like a man who needed warmth. Iker lay with his cheek on his sleeve and his eyes open, counting some private clock he didn't share with men or weather. Pilgrim lay back and let the stars arrange themselves around his breath. He thought of the Gernika battalion photograph in a Myers kitchen. The stubborn faces, the banner that named a town the world had already tried to forget once. He thought of men in the 13th Demi-Brigade of the French Foreign Legion who had learned to disappear by moving forward and had come home with silence where newsreels should have been. He thought of Lorea's hand on his, and of the Terrier's hat brim cutting the world into manageable pieces, and of the coal that burned behind his eyes and would not go out if he didn't. "Half the hour," he whispered to himself. Iker's voice came out of the dark, quiet. "Dawn takes his hour away," he said, "but it gives him sight. He will be nearer soon, and slower. We will be slower too. That is when men break." Pilgrim closed his eyes and saw rails and wagons and dates and a thin seam in the enemy's mouth. "We won't," he said. Gabi made a small sound that could have been agreement, or could have been the mountain asking for less talk. The wind answered for him by lying down. Far below, a dog barked once and then remembered to be an animal and not a tool. The last flare grumbled itself out and left the night alone. They slept as men sleep who have a job no one else can do for them, and the mountain watched them with its old, unreadable face, while the east learned how to be morning.
Chapter 7. White Breath, Black Stone.
Dawn scraped the ridge with a dull knife and left the light thin. Frost stitched every tuft of grass into wire. When Pilgrim exhaled, his breath rose white and broke apart on the wind. Above, the slope tilted into a pale lip that looked soft until you touched it. Nothing was soft here. Stone wore ice like a bad idea that had learned to live. Iker checked straps without looking at his hands. Gabi snugged the rope with 2 small pulls that said, "We are connected and do not forget it." They moved before the day could learn their names. The crust took the first 2 steps, then tested the third with malice. Crampon points bit, demanded trust. Pilgrim put his boots in the exact geometry of Iker's heels, edge, edge, flat. Wind came down from the north with the voice of iron filings in a jar. "Stay on the windward side of the cornice," Gabi murmured. "Leeward is a lie." He tapped where the drift hung out past True Ridge, tunk hollow, then closer to rock, thunk, honest. They walked the spine. France cold and grey to the left, Spain darker to the right, a promise still under its blanket. Pilgrim stared only at the next foot length of white. The Terrier lived behind him not as a man, but as a pressure in the air, half the hour, perhaps less now. Patience sharpening into intent. A thin crack ran through the lip ahead, a place winter had already argued with itself. Iker stepped it without ceremony. Pilgrim set his toe, felt the slab sigh. The world tipped, the rope went live. Gabi's weight dropped, precise, no drama. Iker punched his staff to rock. The sound carried truth through the snow. Pilgrim sagged a handspan. The slab tore from itself and slid, then became someone else's problem. His other boot found stone. "Breathe," Iker said. Tone mild enough to insult panic. "Place," again. Pilgrim breathed. He placed. The ridge accepted the apology. They moved. They reached a shoulder where wind wrote fewer letters and tucked behind a snag of rock. Gabi pulled a glove, set his palm to stone. "Black," he said, as if affirming the day's title. He turned the hand. Rope scars fine as map lines crossed the skin, lessons from the 13th Demi-Brigade of the French Foreign Legion, edited by the Pyrenees. "If you grab hard, it takes your skin," he said. "So don't grab hard." Pilgrim nodded. The absence under his boot still moved in him. He looked at Iker and found steadiness that came not from strength, but from choosing the same thing again when fear offered easier choices. They traversed a bowl paved in old avalanches, debris set like concrete. Iker cut a shallow diagonal that stole height the honest way. Below, the valley lifted noises in pieces. Dog once, truck twice, a horn too proud of itself. Somewhere down there the Terrier would find the customs cut and the damp ledger with its mirror set one nail lower. He would read that detail and bank it. He would not be angry yet. He would give the anger a job. A shrine sat on the lip, a rough stone marked with a dry lauburu. Someone had rubbed fat into the cut so the symbol kept its voice. Ika touched the edge with the backs of his fingers, respect not superstition, and moved on. Gabi paused a breath longer. Some men carry their dead until climbs decide who comes home. They slipped under a shallow overhang and traded the knot at Pilgrim's waist for one that would forgive a mistake once. Ika passed the skin, a slice of bread hard as honesty. "Your hands," he said, taking Pilgrim's fingers, rubbing heat into them as if metal shouldn't be wasted. "You need them for more than keys." Pilgrim tried a smile. It worked halfway. "I need them to carry a head," he said. "I know," Ika answered, not asking. He set Pilgrim's palms on the rock. "Feel it. It is not an enemy, it is the rule book. Don't argue with rules, learn them." Wind spilled over the lip again, tasting of snow higher up that hadn't chosen its fall. Gabi listened. North, south, then directly east, down the corrugated face they'd crossed in the half-dark, measuring angles, selecting futures. "He is nearer," Gabi said. "The Terrier. He left men to the roads and kept the mountain for himself." The Pilgrim felt it, the air narrower by a finger. Lorea's quick hands flickered in his mind. Mayalen turning back to answer questions in a town that trusts the right voice. Amaya's tin and the Gernika photograph, stubborn eyes, a banner that was a town and a grief. Gabi's rope scars, the coal's heat behind Pilgrim's eyes, dates, sidings, a soft place in the occupier's jaw. The question came out of him. "Ika, why do you do this? Carry men you don't know." Ika leaned his back to rock and looked through Pilgrim at a picture Pilgrim couldn't see. "My brother," he said. "Mikil. He put on a Legion coat when other flags made us choke. The coat was honest. It told him he might die and asked if he'd like to do it standing. He took the bargain. He came home once with sand in his boots and a look like he'd read a story he couldn't retell. He said only this: 'Carry each other until the road changes its mind.' He went back. The road changed its mind without asking mine. The letters stopped." Pilgrim understood more than the words delivered. "So you carry strangers." "I carry anyone the law won't," Ika said, "and I ask the hill to return the favour some day. It's business between us." He tapped the rope. "If you fall, I hold, even if it cuts me." Gabi made a small sound, agreement, or the mountain reminding them it was older than all their vows. "We move," he said. They edged out from the pocket and onto a traverse the wind had been polishing all winter. The crust was trustworthy and slick enough to punish trust. Pilgrim set his weight. Transferred, set again. His rhythm became a prayer the legs could say without asking permission from the head. Half a bowl away, light broke a seam in cloud, laid 10 seconds of silver over the ridge ahead, then went. Enough to show a line of steps cutting west to east. Not goat, not sheep. A single man with careful feet, coming across the slope, lighter than Gabi, heavier than Ika. The heel bit a shade more than the toe. The stride apologized to the mountain. Ika crouched, touched the print's edge, and brought a grain of ice to his tongue like a sommelier. He closed his eyes and read the day in it. Fresh boot grease from last night, cinder grit not from farms but from a track bed, a breath of anise and pepper where someone had been clever with dogs. He stood, mouth thin. "He has a guide," Ika said, "or he stole a guide's habits." "The Terrier," Pilgrim said. Gabi nodded once, the soldier's acceptance of a fact that won't move for wishing. "We teach him something else," he said. Ika shortened the rope with neat turns, 10 feet instead of 20. "Close," he said. "The coal will try to make us proud. Pride is a slope." They faced into the higher wind and went on, toward the shallow saddle where the cornice hummed to itself like a sleeping beast, and toward the last shelves that leaned over the country Pilgrim had not yet earned. They faced into the saddle. Wind combed the drift until it sang, a thin metallic hum inside the cornice. Ika tested with his staff, tap to shadow, tap to rock. Writing a Morse, the mountain would answer if it felt like humour. Gabi brought them in tight on the rope, 10 feet nose to tail, the knot at Pilgrim's waist breathing with his ribs. The cornice groaned, a deep animal sound made by snow that had forgotten it was only water. Then a hush fell so complete the ears ached. Pilgrim knew that silence. The world holds its breath before it throws a plate. The hit came sideways, a fist of air from the north. Snow dust rose in a glittering hiss. The cornice cracked somewhere inside itself, a private complaint. Iker angled into the gust, low, wide, calm, every place he put his weight an insult to panic. Pilgrim made himself smaller, let the rope tell him he existed, and moved when the staff ahead said now without speaking. 3 minutes that were a year later, they stepped off the lip and into a lee that felt like a chapel where the roof had fallen in, but the holiness stayed. Gabi grunted once. Gratitude shortened to a sound so it wouldn't slow them. Beyond the lee, the ridge unrolled a shallow col like a flattened blade. Left, leeward, a shadow where the drift hung dangerous and pretty. Right, windward, a seam of scoured truth hard as iron. Iker didn't argue with the rule-book. He chose the ugly way. They crossed with the wind in their teeth. The scoured strip was bad for ankles and good for not existing. Pilgrim set his points to mimic the exact geometry of Iker's heels. Edge, edge, flat. His calves sang a flame song. His lungs rasped in time. The coal in his head pulsed with every step. Dates, sidings, a soft hour in the occupier's jaw that would harden if he failed to carry it south. Half coal, the cloud tore. Sun took a breath. 10 seconds of silver lay over a line of steps cutting west to east above them. Not goat, not sheep. A single man with careful feet, heel a touch heavier than toe, stride apologetic toward the slope. Iker crouched, pressed a knuckle to the print, lifted a fleck of ice to his tongue, and read the day in it. Fresh grease, cinder grit not born of farms, a pinch of anise and pepper where someone had been clever with dogs. He stood with his mouth thin. He learns, Iker said. He hired a habit or stole one. The Terrier, Gabi agreed. The word didn't need air. The wind carried the shape of it. Pilgrim didn't look back. He could feel the nearness, a narrowing of the day from a hallway to a door. Quarter of the hour, maybe less. He imagined the man registering the custom-cut ledger at the hut, noting the mirror a nail lower, pocketing anger without spending it, then walking the ridge like it was a sentence he intended to finish. Short rope, Iker said. Gabi snugged another loop around his waist, the line now a stern conversation rather than a suggestion. The coal finished with a flourish of black slabs, steps made by a mason who had lost interest. Below them, trees waited, pines fat with snow and beech that kept last year's brown leaves like an argument. Spain breathed resin somewhere in that dark. France lay to the left, grey, patient, full of law. They crossed the slabs slow, 3 points of contact, rope slack enough to forgive, tight enough to insist. A raven scissored the wind above and laughed once, because ravens can afford it. Pilgrim placed, transferred, placed. His breath learned to be quiet again. Past the slabs, the slope eased to a wide shoulder. Between shoulder and forest ran a gully not much wider than a cart track, its lip cut clean by winter's teeth. A wire fence sagged across the far rim, 3 rusted strands and a post leaning into its own fatigue. Beyond the fence, the first line of pines made a black weather promise. Iker lifted his chin, a nod a man saves for a threshold. There, he said. Not through the fat of the gully. Along the seam, wind scour, hard and mean. Bad ground for stories. Gabi glanced uphill and down, measuring the angles that could betray a man. Dogs are below, he said. Not far. The bark turns in the hollows. The handlers have learned to keep their voices in their mouths. And him? Pilgrim asked, though his bones already knew. Gabi listened a breath longer. The wind brought no words, just intention. He is on the line, Gabi said, not lifting his feet more than he must, not wasting eyesight on the wrong beauties. Then we give him nothing beautiful, Iker said, and no mistakes to read. They moved to the seam. Here the snow was plain to steel by the wind. The colour drained out of it until it held nothing but function. Crampon points ticked a rhythm. Staffs wrote small permissions. Pilgrim let his world be the next 6 inches and refused all other offers. The coal inside him kept time with the mountain. A timetable turned into an oath. At a notch where the seam pinched, the wind fell without warning, then returned with the weight of a door. Pilgrim bent into it, small, obedient to rope and rule. The cornice to their left thrummed. Somewhere in its belly a fracture crept and then changed its mind. The seam went on, unforgiving and, miracle enough, reliable. They cleared the pinch and tucked behind a rock where the drift had formed a low wall. Iker checked Gabi's side without asking permission. Gabi lifted his coat and let the glance be enough. The bruise had spread like spilled wine. He tightened his belt and put the pain somewhere a soldier keeps his spare patience. "Still rope," he said. "Still legs." "That is the job," Ika answered. He looked at Pilgrim. 10 minutes, he said. Then pines. Pilgrim nodded. His jaw ached from holding silence in the right shape. He let his eyes go south for a heartbeat. The line out there was not a line. No paint, no guard, no speech. Just a place where snow drifted different and stone had a haircut from another country. The thought put warmth in his throat and then took it away on purpose. Not yet. They slid off the rock and finished the seam. The gully opened beside them with a little malevolent innocence. The far lip wore that sagging wire fence like a shrug. A saved shepherd's trick appeared where Ika wanted it to. A knee-high crawl under a tumbled section of the old boundary wall, stones loose as knuckles, the darkness behind them black as someone else's memory. Not for now, Ika said, measuring distance and time like a cooper. For later, if later moves too fast. Gabby nodded. "We'll come back to it if men down there earn their food," he said. The seam bent into a shelf no wider than Pilgrim's patience. Beyond it, the snow thinned under pines that had learned to eat wind for breakfast. Resin rode the air. The white below the branches had the stingy look of snow that was tired of being walked on. Wind shifted, and the ridge behind spoke a single quiet sentence in a voice Pilgrim had learned to recognize without words. The Terrier, nearer now. Not urgent, precise. Men obeyed him by tightening their own coats. "Quarter," Ika murmured. "Perhaps less." "Enough," Gabby said, "if we do not give him a mistake to love." They took the shelf crabwise, rope snug, staffs writing a beat the slope would accept. The fence rode their left shoulder like a line drawn by a bored clerk. The pines thickened, making weather kind out of obligation. At the fence, Ika put his palm to a leaning post and pressed until the wood gave a little the way an old man's knee does when it's asked nicely. The wire sighed. "Not here," he said. "A hunter looks where a thing looks broken. We cross where it looks stubborn." 30 paces on, the strands ran higher, drifted nearly level with the snow. Gabby lifted one with his staff, low and gentle. Ika pressed another with his forearm. Pilgrim stepped through sideways, rope whispering, coat brushing metal with the faintest tin bite. No chime, no story for the men behind. Pine took them in with a different grammar. Sound muffled to wool, wind chopped into pieces and fed to needles. Underfoot, snow thinned to a stingy crust and then to duff that took prints but didn't volunteer them to strangers. The air smelled like turpentine, remembered as childhood. Pilgrim's legs found a little mercy and mistrusted it. He could taste the line now the way a blind man reads a room with his hands. The coal in his skull flared once in joy and he pressed it down. Joy writes mistakes. He thought of Lorea's fingers tracing his palm, of Myalen's left corner smile, of Ita Zabier's bell and the old Lauburu rubbed with fat, of the Gernika eyes stubborn against the lens, of Gabby's rope scars and Ika's brother's last unwritten letter. He let the weight of them sharpen rather than soften him. "Last shelf," Ika said softly, pointing through the trunks. Beyond, a shallow run of open white leaned toward darker trees on the far side. After that, the slope rolled into Spain in a way a man could stand on without being killed for the view. "Not the longest step," Gabby said. His mouth allowed itself the ghost of a smile, "but you'll smell it from there." A jay muttered once and shut up, as if it, too, had read the etiquette of borders. Behind, the wind carried a dog's single bark and the shape of a command that didn't need volume. The shelf waited, narrow as a vow, plain as a rule. They moved toward it, heads down, rope live, the world reduced to breath and placement, and the seam between two countries that had not asked the mountain for permission, but would get away with it for a little while longer.
Chapter 8. The Terrier's Shadow.
The last shelf narrowed to the width of nerve. To Pilgrim's left, the slope fell toward pines that breathed resin and Spain. To his right, France dropped away, grey and patient and full of men who would happily finish his story before noon. Ika's heel wrote the path, Gabi's rope wrote the rule. Pilgrim did the arithmetic of survival, edge, edge, flat, breathe, place, breathe. A voice rose behind them that wasn't wind, not loud, precise. It arrived as we will do it this way. The shelf seemed to tighten in answer. "The Terrier," Gabby said, so softly it felt like the mountain said it for him. Ika didn't look back. Closer. They slipped into the pines. Under the branches the snow thinned and the world wore wool. Needles took the noise out of their steps. Ica set them on a diagonal that bled height slowly toward the darker seam of a buried stream. A jay scolded, reconsidered civic duty, and shut up. Pilgrim's legs shook in the honest way of legs that had worked and been told to work harder. The coal behind his eyes kept time with his breath, dates, sidings, a soft hour in the occupier's jaw that would harden if he failed to deliver it south. At the stream bed, Garby tapped with his staff until the snow-red hollow not treachery. "Under," he whispered. "Water carries sound the wrong way." They slid into the white corridor and let the banks lift their noise into nothing. At the entry, Ica dotted Anis with 2 careful taps, enough to make a dog sneeze in doubt, not enough to teach a handler caution. A metallic crack tore the quiet, then another, flatter, from below. Not rock, rifles. Bark jumped off a trunk ahead and nicked Pilgrim's scalp, a hot, petty bite. Gabby's palm put him flat. A third shot stitched air where his head had wanted to be. "They saw movement, not you," Ica said, unruffled. "Keep low." Something shifted left, brown cloth, the hump of a pack, then froze so completely it became part of the tree that held it. Gabby drew breath to cool and swallowed it. Ica shook his head once. No names now. The cracking stopped. Voices murmured, measured, the terrier's habit fanning out into lesser copies. A dog barked twice. A handler hissed it down. Snow squeaked where men tried to learn a mountain's grammar with boots. Ahead, a low stone hut hunched, a border, roof like a shrug, a thread of smoke lifting from a pipe small as a knuckle. An old man stood at the door, coat mended to honesty, cap low, shoulders of someone who had read more winters than papers. He lifted his chin once at Ica, once at Pilgrim, then up the slope toward the inch of ridge that would deliver the terrier if the day kept its promises. He went inside as if to say, "I will make a door, you make a road." Ica slid them beneath a deadfall, followed the stream 20 paces, and lifted them out where the bank softened. The hut door opened. The old man came out with a sack and placed it on a stump with the ceremony of people who have never owned the luxury of dropping things. He poked a turnip loose with theatrical irritation and bent with old knees to fetch it, all the while letting his steps be boring for the eyes that were learning them. The terrier arrived with 2 men and a dog, and no fuss. He didn't aim his weapon. He rarely needed to. He inspected the hut, the smoke, the drift by the threshold, not touching, listening with his fingertips. A simple question in plain French, smooth as wood. The old man answered with a century in his mouth. Basque first, then rough French like a coat over a sweater. Wood cut, soup on, sheep seen, foot sore, eyes poor. He prodded the sack again. The turnip bumped the stump obediently. The terrier knelt, pressed 2 fingers into the trampled snow, lifted them, and read something only his nose and patience understood. He touched the chimney shadow, watched the smoke colour, counted with his mouth closed. Then he spoke one sentence that sent a man east and another north without salutes. He left the old man standing, unarrested. Not mercy, only exactness. He turned his face to the trees and scented the seam of quiet where Pilgrim waited. Then, deliberately, he looked away, as if he had registered the stream-bed's secret and chosen, for now, to taste a different one. "Sideways," Ica breathed, already moving. They ghosted along a contour the trees had learned to hold, keeping the stream to their hip and the hut in their memory. Another shot, far back, murdered a fist-sized patch of innocent snow for courage. The old man coughed once and went inside, slow as a prayer. The land lifted. The stream narrowed to a silver wire and disappeared under a white lid. Ica paced them onto a rib of rock where scent died and tracks told fewer stories. The wind brought a new sound. Bells, not sheep, bronze heavier with a wobble. A team. A cart. They broke the trees at a shelf where an unmarked path cut southwest. A cart stood across it, stubbornly broad, axles sunk, nose toward Spain, rump toward France. 2 oxen shook their heads and chimed. A farmer leaned his shoulder to the stuck wheel, swearing with the authority of men who build their days out of friction. "Unai's cousin," Ica murmured. "He owes no man favours and keeps paying them anyway." The farmer didn't look at them. He heaved. The bells thrashed their complaint. Down valley a dog barked, then remembered obedience. The terrier would come straight, not to the cart at first. He would run a hand under the trees and see what shook, then look and calculate whether 5 minutes of pushing someone else's problem would cost him a part of himself he liked too much to spend. Stall, Gaby said, admiring and sad. "He may lose the oxen or the cart or his teeth tonight." Pilgrim's stomach knotted. "We could." "No," Ika said. "We can use it or waste it. Those are the choices." The bells chimed again. The farmer grunted. Behind them, the mountain's patient voice shaped itself into the Terrier's, quiet orders that arrived as, "Of course, that is what I meant." Snow on the track brightened where men were about to step. Ika's fingers touched Pilgrim's sleeve. "Now," he whispered, "sideways and down. Take the gully that doesn't want to exist." They moved, stealing the sound of bells to hide their own, and angled for a narrow cut in the hillside where winter had been sharpening a blade all season. They slid off the road's sight line and into the cut that didn't want to exist. Snow deepened there, the world thinning to elbows and breadth. Gaby went first, staff marking pockets that would hold a foot, then another. Ika followed, counting steps for later, in case later needed to find this slot from the far side. Pilgrim put his boots where the mountain agreed to hold him, and nowhere else. The gully bent once and pinched. Ika stopped, knelt at a low wall of stacked stone disguised as fallen hillside. He lifted the top rock a thumb's width. Cold black opened under it like a secret that had chosen its listeners. "In," he said. "Head first. Boots last." "What is it?" Pilgrim whispered, already wriggling. "A crawl 30 feet, Gaby answered. "Air you can borrow but not own. It spits you into a ditch the wind forgets." Stone took Pilgrim's shoulders without malice or welcome. The world narrowed to damp wool, sheep fat, old smoke, the smell of poor men who had needed this hole before borders became paperwork. Elbows, hip, push. The roof brushed his cap and then his scalp where the bark had nicked it. He tasted iron. The rope hummed behind as Ika fed him forward and Gaby fed Ika. A slit of iron-coloured light widened. He slid out into a shallow ditch, sheeted thin with ice. Spain lay 6 feet away, no paint, no guard, just a toppled boundary stone with snow lipped along its top edge, like a grin it hadn't finished. Ika wriggled beside him, pulled the packs through, then pressed the stones back as if apologizing for the intrusion. Gaby came last, tamping the top rock with the heel of his hand until it settled exactly as 2 winters had taught it. He froze, listening. Behind, voices braided. A handler with an obedient dog, a man whose boots tried to sound like patience, and the Terrier, the quiet that tells other sounds to choose a shape. Closer now. The oxen's bells thrashed once, a bright metallic panic, a curse, a shot, sloppy, frightened, another shot, tidier, then the bell again, frantic, then abrupt stillness that made Pilgrim's stomach cramp. He half stood. Gaby's hand fixed him to the ditch like a nail. "No," the legionary said, "you pay what he bought by carrying what he bought it for." Pilgrim swallowed. The air tasted of penny and pine. He closed his eyes and put the timetable in front of himself the way a drowning man puts the shore there, sidings, dates, one soft hour where steel could be made to forget itself. He opened his eyes. "Forward," he said, and the word cost him a tooth he would never grow back. Ika nodded once and began to move. The ditch bent, hid them, and then offered a sheep path that knew which side of the hill it loved. Gaby snapped a twig, brushed their prints where the ditch gave up being a ditch, and smeared the cut end with a polite breath of anise and pepper before feeding it to snow. They rose into broom. Pine took the wind and broke it into kindness. Ahead, roofs tucked themselves around a small chapel with a wooden door polished by generations of knuckles. Beyond, a cart track wrote a sentence toward a crossroads, and a tiled roof with a small flag, the smallest possible country doing its job. Ika aimed them not at the roofs, not yet, but at a stand of beach that marked an old line. He set Pilgrim's hand on the smooth bark. "Now," he said quietly, "you feel it?" Pilgrim did. Nothing visible, everything certain. Stone cut different, snow drifted different, trees standing like they'd been read a different story in their sapwood. Spain was this side of breath. He kept the breath inside. Joy writes mistakes. "Not this door," Ika said, pointing at the hamlet. "Not yet. Men with hats have questions there. We use the smaller door first and arrive honest to the bigger one after." They slid along the beach and into pine shadow again. Wind thinned to wool. A robin ticked them once like a pocket watch and decided they weren't worth time. Down valley, a command rose, patient, exact, the Terrier telling men how to be useful without raising his voice. Another dog bark, immediately shushed. The mountain's grammar had been read at last. Now men were trying to speak it. At a shallow fall in the ground, a fence slumped, 3 rusted strands, a post that had chosen fatigue over stubbornness. "Not here," Ika murmured. "A hunter looks where the world looks broken." 30 paces on, the wire ran higher, drifted nearly level with the snow. Gabi levered the top strand with his staff, low and gentle. Ika pressed the second with his forearm. Pilgrim slid through sideways, coat brushed metal with the faintest tin bite. No song, no story for the men behind. Pine thickened. Snow went stingy underfoot, and then gave way to duff that kept their prints like a confidant that wouldn't gossip. Resin rode the air, sharp as memory, kind as bread. Pilgrim's legs found a little mercy and mistrusted it. He kept his world to breath and placement, and the rope a quiet voice at his waist. The trees thinned onto a last narrow shelf of open white leaning toward a darker band of trunks on the far side. Beyond that, the slope rolled into Spain as if it had forgotten to argue about it. "Last shelf," Ika said, "not the longest step, close enough to smell it." Gabi listened uphill. The ridge behind said a single sentence, very quiet, and men obeyed it by tightening their coats. "Quarter of the hour," he said, "maybe less." "Enough," Ika answered, "if we do not give him something to love." They took the shelf crabwise, rope snug, staffs writing permissions the slope would accept. The wind pressed a hand to Pilgrim's chest and tried to ask him a question he didn't have breath to answer. He put his boot where Ika's heel had signed and nowhere else. A jay muttered once and remembered border etiquette. The shelf ended at a sagging run of wire, then stepped them into trees that smelled like someone else's childhood. Spain breathed resin, closer now, and Pilgrim denied himself the luxury of imagining tea. The ground under the pines had a different honesty, less ice, more rule. Ika stopped at a beach that had held up 1,000 storms and a few men's names. He placed Pilgrim's palm to its skin again, then let go. "This is it," he said. "Not the door with the man and the pen. The door the hill keeps." Behind them, a single bark climbed the slope like a thrown stone and fell short. The terrier's voice did not follow. He would be busy being exact where the cart had been, and the bell had learned to be still. Pilgrim stood on the invisible edge and let the weight of the road climb his bones and settle. The boy with the brewery cart, the soot-browed woman and her door that wasn't, Myalen's left corner smile, Ita Zabier's hand on a bell rope and the tiny kiss of clapper to bronze, Unai and Joxe and their municipal crate that had spilled nothing loudly, the ledger with its mirror 1 nail lower, the old man at the border gifting minutes he could never earn back, the oxen's bell thrashing and then not, Gabi's rope scars, Ika's brother's last unwritten letter, the Gernika faces in a legion coat that told hard truths, the Pyrenees themselves saying yes and no and yes again. He did not step. Not yet. Ika's fingers pressed his sleeve. "Sideways," he murmured, smiling as if at a private joke the hill shared. "Then down. Then we decide which door with a pen we trust." They moved, and the line, unmarked and absolute, slid under Pilgrim's boots like a river you only feel when you've already crossed it. Not the longest step, but close enough to feel the ground change its mind about who it belonged to.
Chapter 9. The Last Switchback.
Spain took them in without ceremony and then immediately asked for proof. The pines closed ranks, the slope tilted, and the track that had pretended to be a path decided to be a suggestion. Wind slid off the ridge in sheets, colder now, carrying the iron taste of weather that hadn't made up its mind about being a storm or a warning. "Not down yet," Ika said. "Down is where men wait to be proud of stopping you." Gabi pointed with his chin. A pale fan lay under a wall of rock, old avalanche run-out, glazed and sulking. Above it, a shoulder of snow wore the dead calm of a thing that had taken too long to think and now wanted to act all at once. "Cut right," Gabi murmured. "Under the ribs. Touch stone when you can. If the slab talks, don't answer." They edged across the first rib, then the second, keeping to the dark seams where wind had shaved truth bare. Pilgrim set his points, transferred, set again. Edge, edge, flat. Breathe, place, breathe. The coal behind his eyes kept its own count. Columns shifting, wagons, sidings, a tender window that would close if he didn't put those numbers into the right ears soon. He held the figures like a hot coin against the tongue. Don't drop it. Don't swallow it. Midway across the third rib the slab did talk. A low whump under the skin, a drum through a wall. The surface settled a finger's breadth under Pilgrim's right boot. The rope went live. Garby's weight dropped, precise as a nail being set. Iker planted his staff to stone and took in a palm of slack, making the world smaller. "Back one," Iker said, tone mild enough to insult panic. "Donkey knees, old man steps, let the slab remember you are not here to make it famous." Pilgrim shifted to the last honest place. The sound stopped. The mountain kept its opinion to itself. They angled higher, found rock again, crossed, and the fan below stayed a promise. Wind felt them and moved on. A stand of beech waited where the traverse ended, last year's brown leaves clinging like doctrine. Lee-side, the world became briefly human. Breath hurt less going out. Gabby rolled his shoulder and winced. "You're hit?" Pilgrim asked, too sharp. "Stone," Gabby said. "The ridge kept a piece of me." He thumbed his belt tighter. The pain went somewhere a soldier knows how to store it. Below, bells rang the wrong rhythm for a church. Carabineros, or Guardia men, marking time loudly. Iker listened and counted the pause between notes. "They want you to believe they are bored," he said. "They are not, but they are warm." "Warm men make mistakes," Gabi said. "Cold men break," Iker answered. "I do not like either." They began the switchbacks, each turn a decision about belief. Snow deeper here, heavy on the branches, sulkier on the ground. The trail cut a letter S into the slope over and over. Pilgrim's knees complained. He told them they were hired for the whole day. Hand to bark, boot to edge, breath to count. He kept his world the width of the next choice. At the third bend, a small dark shape crouched under a leaning pine. A hermitage barely larger than a wardrobe, knee-high, roof of slate, door a scrap of wood tied with twine. A bolt of blue thread blew from a nail and wrote a bright curve in the grey. Iker knelt, untied the door, lifted it enough to make an opening. Inside, a stub of candle, a tin saint, a chipped cup, and wrapped in oilcloth, a notebook swollen by winter. He handed it over with a look that said, "Don't worship it, don't ignore it." Pilgrim read the first page by stingy light, names in pencil, dates, gratitude in 2 languages and a third with Basque bones. Gracias. Eskerikasco. Wind north, dogs, don't use the bridge. He turned pages. Storm took a man here, coins left. Take the high beach when bells ring wrong. Farther in, a steadier hand had sketched a wedge of slope and a gully with a row of little crosses where men had learned too late that snow can become water all at once if asked badly. At the last spread, the pencil was stingier, as if written with gloves. 2 arrows. Ibaneta watched, bent her to know. Under the second, a tiny lobaru and a line. Eche Zahara, old house. He slid the book back into its skin and tied the door shut. The same hand had cropped up across months, tidying other men's notes, leaving a small map for those who knew what to look for. Amaya's kitchen flickered in his mind. The Gernika photograph propped against salt jars. Men who had held sandbars at the end, and men who had gone to the 13th Demi-Brigade of the French Foreign Legion because the only coat that didn't choke them was the one that told hard truths. The road here belonged to those men too. "Bentartea," Iker said, reading Pilgrim's face. "Old sheep line. Men with uniforms hate angles that look untidy from a desk." Gabi listened downslope. Voices changed. The bell turned frantic, time suddenly urgent. "The Terrier found someone willing to be useful," he said. "Spanish side. Loud hat. Louder boots." "He will not cross with a gun," Iker said. "He will cross with a suggestion." They moved again, taking the bends as the slope would permit, short-cutting where the crust was honest, doubling the curve where it wasn't. A jay tracked them, disgruntled at their competence. Pilgrim lifted his scarf. The nick on his scalp had scabbed into a crust that cracked when he frowned. He spared the farmer with the oxen a thought and refused to give that thought teeth. "Keep the thing moving," he told himself. "Pay later." Snow decided. It came down like a habit. The air filled with a million soft sounds, each insisting on being the only one. The switchbacks erased themselves as Pilgrim watched. "Good," Iker said. "The slope forgets we were here." "Bad," Gabi countered. "We forget where we meant to go." "Then we make a new meaning," Iker said, and edged into the white exactly where a man who had never been here would not. They followed shapes, tree stance, wind's throat, the way branches wore snow heavier on one side. Pilgrim read each clue and passed it forward with his soles. He read the swallow and release of sound to judge which gully held a stream and which held regret. He read the cold in his hands and rubbed heat into his fingers because he would need them to hold a rope and a future both. The old house arrived by pretending not to exist until they were almost on it. A low rectangle sunk into the hillside, turf roof, door stone with a personality, walls the colour of the day. Iker slid a mittened hand into the eave and tugged twice. The lintel lifted a thumb's width, a breath of poor people's weather, smoke, wool, onion, iron, sighed out. Inside, almost nothing, and enough. 2 clay jugs, a ladder to a loft no taller than a vow, a nail with a lantern. Gabby cupped the match and lit it. Yellow made a small sun that didn't travel. On the back wall, 5 names scratched with a nailhead, 5 dates, each with a tiny cross to the right, some with a second cross that might have meant safe. Underneath, Eche Zahara Zain Dago, the old house waits. Pilgrim read them with the care he gave his coal. He knew not one of those men and all of them. He touched the wall with the back of his fingers, the way Iker did when stone had done its work well. Gabi sank to the threshold and finally let the wound have a corner. He peeled back his coat. The bloom above his hip was wider, edges angry. He poured a clear sting onto a rag and pressed it home, the pain showing only in the eyes. "Stop?" Pilgrim asked. "Stop, and the terrier inherits the day," Gabi said. "I can place. I can be rope. That is all your life needs of me." Iker set out the last of Amaya's packet. 3 minutes, he said. "Then we climb the last rib and cut into Bent Artea. There is a chapel under the cliff, just stone and a name. After that, the path hangs its arm over Spain and becomes a road a man can be seen on without dying." "And men below?" Pilgrim asked. "They will close the wrong door," Iker said. "If he is as clever as we respect him for being, he will smell the right one and arrive late." His mouth tilted. "Late is a weather he does not like. We will walk in it." Snow thickened, smoothing the edges off the day. The lantern made its small sun and guarded it. Pilgrim forced bread past a throat that had forgotten food and felt human relight like a pilot flame. He put his palm to the scapula in his pocket and to the coal behind his eyes in the same motion, and promised both that he would not let the figures cool. Outside, the wind changed key. "Time," Iker said. "Last rib." They stepped back into the sift, the old house closing its breath behind them, like a witness that knew when to keep quiet. They left the old house and shouldered into the weather. The last rib lifted under them, talking softly about gravity and pride. Iker kept to shade where the crust stayed honest. Gabi's rope hand bled a little where skin had gone. He wrapped the line once more around his waist and turned pain into duty. The Bent Artea gully announced itself by being nothing, an absence in the slope, a place snow fell into and didn't return from until spring. On its left, rock showed like ribs. On its right, dwarf pines hunched like old men glad of excuses to sit. Midway down the far lip clung a dark rectangle under a cliff, the chapel, hardly a building, more a refusal. They cut down and across. The gully pretended to dislike them, then let them through. The chapel held them 1 breath longer than men can justify. Gabi tapped the slab with 2 fingers. Iker laid the little nailed soles on the knee-worn shelf and picked them up again, an in-joke with the hill. Pilgrim touched the scapula in his pocket and the coal behind his eyes in the same motion, promising both he would not let the figures cool. Below the chapel, the path remembered how to be a path. The switchbacks were honest. The trees argued less. Far down, a strip of darker grey cut the forest, road. Vehicles nodded through it like tired beasts. Lights flared, died, flared. A checkpoint, or men rehearsing one. Gabi squinted. "Carabineros," he said, "and 1 hat that doesn't belong to that coat." "The terrier," Pilgrim said. "He has the manner of a man who belongs everywhere he visits," Iker said. "But he is still a visitor. Visitors don't own doors." They took another switchback and then one that wasn't there until Iker asked the slope for it. Voices rode the wind thinly. The terriers carried because quiet does. He said 1 thing and 2 men moved as if they'd thought of it themselves. He said a second and a dog forgot hunger. "Decision," Iker said. "Left to the mule bridge where men are loudly bored, or right, under the road where a culvert forgets its job when the stream runs low." "Culvert," Gabi answered. "Culvert," Pilgrim echoed. He could read it without seeing it, a throat under the road that would carry men and secrets if asked respectfully. They slid into the stream's shallow cut, where ice held on like an old argument. The culvert mouth yawned black, lip-rhymed, stone-slick with a skin too thin to trust and too real to ignore. Gubby went first, palms, toes, shoulder, his profile becoming an animal built for tight spaces. Pax came next, then Pilgrim, then Ika last, listening. Inside smelled of soil and time. Echo made liars of distance. A scrape behind could have been in front. A scuff above could have been memory. They moved anyway. Halfway, light arrived in a hairline seam, the gap between a slab and the roadbed where someone had failed to tamp the world shut. Voices crossed it. One voice had patience you could taste. Here, it said softly, then there. Snow dust sifted through the seam. Powder stung Ika's cheek like a private insult. He didn't blink. He breathed once, slow, and eased them on. The culvert spat them into a ditch full of sullen water and reeds pretending to sleep. 20 yards downstream, the ditch slid under a wire fence and rose beyond it into Spain. The paperwork would recognize. Above, a cart track ran toward 3 roofs, hugging a chapel with a wooden door polished by knuckles. Smoke lifted from somewhere behind a copse, unwilling to be a signal. Door there, Ika said, chin toward the roofs. And another there, nodding at the trees. Left gives you paper and a room with men who decide things. Right gives you a stove and a blanket and a woman who can set a broken thought. We need the room, Pilgrim said, and a telephone, and a mind at the end of it. They crawled the ditch, slid under the wire where snow had dragged it down, and rose into Broome. The roofs ahead belonged to a hamlet too small to trouble a map. 3 houses, a chapel, a shed that smelled of leather. A woman worked the pump with the comfortable cruelty of habit. She looked at them, saw nothing, and kept pumping. Anne, Ika said, just enough breath to be a name. She didn't turn. Ika, she answered, you owe me a bottle and silence. I bring the bottle and keep the story, he said. You'll bring both, she replied, then flicked her eyes at Gubby's side and at Pilgrim's face. Inside, she said, jerking her chin at the chapel. The man who keeps God keeps a telephone. She caught Gubby's sleeve as he passed and pressed once above the wound. After, she whispered, I have hands. The chapel smelled of wax, chalk, onions, the poor incense of towns that outlast paperwork. A priest with his sleeves rolled was washing a floor with a zeal that believed water could still fix things. He looked up, read Ika, read Gubby, read Pilgrim, set the bucket aside like a man called to a harder sacrament. Padre, Ika said. Hijitos, the priest answered, which in his mouth meant my sons and my guests at once. He lifted a hanging rug and slid a little shelf out of the wall. On it sat a black telephone that looked like it knew secrets. He lifted the receiver, waited, said a name, waited again, then one word more. Ahora! He handed the receiver to Pilgrim. The line hissed, then settled, then a clipped voice, British, T where no T existed. Number? Pilgrim gave it. His hand shook and then obeyed. Operator, Pilgrim, Spain, secure. I have information to pass. He closed his eyes and put the timetable where words could find it. Columns and sidings and one soft hour when steel would forget itself. He spoke, slow, exact, every number as if it were a bootfall on the last shelf. He read back the confirmation and read the silence that meant a mind had caught it and was already chewing. When he hung up, the room grew larger. His legs felt smaller. He leaned his forehead to the cool wall and let the breath he'd been saving for days leave him before it turned to fire. Outside, bells rang wrong. Carabineros arguing with the hour. The Terrier's voice didn't arrive. He was likely busy being precise elsewhere. Snow eased, then remembered how to stop. Ika looked at Gabi's side and said nothing that would make the wound feel important. Anne came in with a kettle and a needle and a jaw set to work. The priest lowered the rug over the little shelf and became a man with a bucket again. Tomorrow, the priest said, practical as bread. Pamplona, San Sebastian, then the British. The road is known even when it pretends not to be. Pilgrim nodded. My Allen, he said. Unai, Jox, the boy Lorea, the farmer. The night keeps the names, Ika said. The hill returns favours when it can. You won't help them by making their payment meaningless. He set a hand on Pilgrim's shoulder. Weight more than comfort. At dawn, the Terrier will stand above the culvert and smile without moving his mouth. He will read that you didn't jump the mule bridge like a tourist. He'll read the ditch, the broom, the woman at the pump. He will put away his anger for later. He saves it. Do not be here to admire his thrift. Pilgrim almost laughed and found no spare breath. The kettle sang. The needle bit. The telephone sat quiet, as if nothing important had ever passed through it. Snow rubbed its shoulder along the chapel windows and moved on. The last piece of the road pulled taut. A car would come. Men with pens would make him accounted for. The longest step was still ahead, small as wood to stone, large as hunted to counted. He closed his eyes, saw the timetable one last time, and let it belong to other hands. "Tomorrow," Ika said. "Tomorrow," Gabby echoed, and finally let the chair keep more of him than the rope had.
Chapter 10. The Longest Step.
Morning made a pale blade of the road. Spain did not bless, it tested. Snow sifted down, fine as flour, the kind that hides tracks without forgiving choices. The chapel still held the damp ghost of Pilgrim's boots where he had stood by the telephone and emptied the coal from his head into a wire that would carry it to British hands. That duty was finished. The road, not yet. Gabby sat on a stool while Ain stitched, jaw set, eyes steady. Ika and the priest mapped a last hour on the table with a crust of bread and a nail. A door here, a lane that forgot to be guarded, a hedge that did not respect paperwork, a culvert that belonged to water more than men. Spanish uniforms drifted the village edge, loud in their boredom. Far uphill, the ridge held a thinner, more dangerous quiet, the sort that belongs to a man counting disappointment like coin. "The Terrier," Ika said. "On the French side," the priest answered. "He does not cross, he convinces." "He will convince," Anne said, biting the thread and palming the needle. "Then he will go home with a hunger a clock can't feed." Gabby stood slower than a soldier likes. He tested his weight, set the pain in a corner where duty could ignore it. "I can place," he said. "I can be rope." "That is all this hour asks," Ika replied. He lifted Pilgrim's scarf and tested the scab with a careful thumb. "You will not faint?" "Not yet," Pilgrim said. "After the door." They left by a door that opened because it remembered how, not because hinges were fine. The village turned its face to other work. Water, bread, a cartwheel coaxed off with a mallet 3 generations old. Ain went to the pump and let the handle proclaim innocence. The priest moved a ladder 2 rungs with the concentration of a long, quiet prayer. The last hour was not a sprint. It was a weave. Orchard, irrigation cut, a low wall of round stones, a pause while a truck coughed its way past its own pride, a move when the cough turned to distance. A knot of Guardia men warmed their hands at a brazier and pretended to be a wall. Ika swore softly about onions and taxes as they slid behind a hedge, giving those men a boring story if they ever discovered curiosity. A child dragged a sled too small for snow. A dog lifted one paw at a time like the ground had betrayed him overnight. The village permitted Pilgrim to be one more moving thing. Permission is a kind of mercy. At the far houses the land lifted into one more shelf. Beyond it, a line of poplars walked a ditch to a crossroads and a tiled roof with a small flag, the smallest version of a country men argue about at tables. That was the door. Not freedom, not yet. The place where hunted becomes counted. After that, Pamplona, San Sebastian suits that cared more for numbers than names. Crossroads, Ika said. Left is the post house and a stamp that makes what you already are into something allowed. Right is a barn, a stove, a woman who can set a broken thought. Left is faster for your coal. Right is kinder to your blood. Left, Pilgrim said. We've spent enough of other people's kindness. Gabi's mouth bent at the corner, unclaimed by pain. Left then, he said. Fast, but not as if we love running. They followed the poplars. Voices rose behind them in 2 flavors, ordinary in the village, exact on the ridge. The Terrier's quiet arrived as obedience elsewhere. A Spanish officer on a horse lifted his chin to taste the weather and did not spur. He liked the idea of spurring more than the work. It pleased Pilgrim irrationally. The flag did not move much. A moustached man stood in the post-house doorway, coat neat, ledger neat. Ika did not look at his face. He looked at the lintel worn by hands, the step polished by boots, the notch in the threshold where winter had its way. Walk, he murmured, like a man who has asked this door for boring favours all his life. They crossed the last yard of snow. The sound under Pilgrim's soles was the same as 100 other places and also different. The note a road makes when it stops arguing with your weight. From the far field came a shout, too precise to belong to villagers. 2 uniforms peeled off a path, cutting across the yard like confident scissors. The man in the doorway lifted a hand, palm out, an old civil gesture that could mean stop or wait or not yet. It carried no fear, only routine, that powerful god. A voice travelled down the lane behind them like a rope thrown gently. French made careful, Monsieur. Then Basque, spoken with a respect that didn't belong to the mouth that held it. The Terrier had arrived without leaving his country. A word. Ika didn't turn. "No," he said, equally soft. "Not for you." Pilgrim looked a fraction over his shoulder, across hedges and ditch and one idea that used to be a line, a hat brim and a narrow face. The Terrier stood with his hands behind his back the way men do when they can take them out quickly, not angry, adding a column that would never quite sum. "You chose well," the Terrier said, not loud. The wind did the carrying. "You left the bridge. You found the throat under the road. You did not let a shot become a plan." His attention moved to Ika and to Gabi, then away without greed. "You are carried by people who know their hills." Pilgrim said nothing. Words would only thicken the air. The post-house step was 1 foot length away. He could feel his heart beating the time between two countries. The moustache in the doorway adjusted his ledger weight and waited because waiting was in his job description. The two uniforms angled closer, not quite deciding whether to act. A gust lifted powder off the yard and made everything briefly new. The Terrier inclined his head, the smallest courtesy and the largest. "Another day," he said. He did not say, "I will find you," or "I will break the road that carried you." He didn't threaten. He existed, and other men would make that enough work. Ika's fingers settled on Pilgrim's sleeve, a weight the law would not notice. "Now," he said. Pilgrim lifted his boot. It felt stupid that a step could be heavier than a climb. It was. All the weight the road had given him rose in his bones to be carried that last inch. The boy with the brewery cart, the soot-browed woman and her door that wasn't. Mayalon's left corner smile, Ita Zabier's hand on the bell rope, Unai and Joxe and their municipal crate that had spilled nothing loudly, the ledger with its mirror 1 nail lower. The old man at the border who spent minutes he could never earn back, the oxen's bell thrashing and then not, Gabi's rope scars, Ika's brother's last unwritten letter, the Gernika eyes, a Legion coat that told hard truths, the Pyrenees saying yes and no and yes again. His heel hovered over wood. The step waited like a question that already knew its answer. The longest step, he set his heel down. Wood took his weight, then stone, the way doors accept decisions. The moustached clerk stepped back, routine opening a lane. Inside smelled of ink and damp wool and a stove that had lost interest in arguing with weather. "Papers," the clerk said, already reaching. Ika answered before Pilgrim could. "Matthew Arnaud, tinsmith," he murmured, the boredom of 1,000 safe lies tucked into 4 words. He laid the card on the desk. The clerk read the smudged prefecture stamp without curiosity. He picked up a pen that had done heavier work than it would admit, and the ledger opened its mouth like a patient animal. "Purpose?" "Roofing," Ika said. "The rain has opinions." The clerk wrote Mathieu first, scratched, wrote Mathieu, shrugged at the world, and stamped. The thud was soft, the violet mark was final. He pushed a chit across. "Go to the house at the crossroads," he said. "Wait. A car will take you to men who decide things." "Gracias," Ika replied, because gratitude must live somewhere. They turned to go. Gabi paused on the threshold, weighing the road south against the thread he had left in his side. Ain stood by the pump, not looking. The priest moved his ladder 1 more rung, as if each step were a bead in a long, stubborn prayer. Across the yard, over hedge and ditch and air, the Terrier watched without blinking. Snow wrote commas in his hair. He did not advance. He did not retreat. He recorded the fact of this minute where it would injure him least, then tilted his face to the ridge as if speaking to the mountain in a language only patient men know. At last he turned and went, half the hour late, exactly as promised. Pilgrim felt the ghost of the rope at his waist. He pressed the scapular in his pocket and the place behind his eyes where the coal had been and was now ash cooling into usefulness because he had emptied it down a wire. Breath left him with a small sound, neither laugh nor sob, only the body agreeing to continue. "Come," Ika said. They crossed to the crossroads house, a low building wearing its tile like a thought. Inside, a clerk's cousin in a heavy sweater regarded them as if storms could be tidied with forms. He waved at a bench and made a ceremony of ignoring them. It was the most generous thing he could do. Minutes stretched, boots thawed, the stove found its courage. Pilgrim's hands shook once and then remembered their job. Gabby sat as if the chair were a gentler rope. Iker kept his eyes half closed, saving the day's last clear edges for anything that might still try to cut them. A motor coughed outside, then settled. Official black, tired chrome, a driver with a hard mouth and an order that did not include questions. The clerk's cousin signed something like a prayer and nodded them out. Snow had softened to dust. The car door opened that particular way doors open for men who are to be moved without being asked for stories. Pilgrim's foot caught on an ordinary rut, and he loved the rut for how unimportant it was. Iker took his sleeve once more. "You owe," he said, not unkind. "I know," Pilgrim answered. "You will pay by living," Iker said, "by telling the truth to men who read only papers, by sending bottles without stories attached." "I will," Pilgrim said. Gabby offered him the Legion's smallest benediction, a nod that felt like a pact. "If the road asks again," he said, "carry someone." "I will," Pilgrim repeated, and the promise felt like a weight he wanted. Anne had drifted to the far corner of the square, back to them, attending to nothing in particular with theatrical care. The priest stood in the chapel door, hands full of ladder, eyes full of salt. Neither waved. In this country, farewells that could be witnessed are debts you cannot pay. Pilgrim got into the car. The seat smelled of old leather and cigarettes. The driver didn't look back. The engine took the first slope. The tires read the road the way men read weather. The village folded behind them, deliberately forgetting. The poplars marched the ditch toward a future someone else would have to own. He looked once more toward the ridge, line against the line of cloud. Up there, the path they'd cut with breath and nerve already blurred. Somewhere on the French side, a man with a terrier's patience would be writing a note in a ledger that didn't exist. Somewhere below that, names scratched into an old wall, faced a door that knew how to open without being seen. Between those places ran a road, Basque, stubborn, generous, carved by hands that had decided refusal was a kind of prayer. The car found a better surface and took speed without show. Signs he could finally afford to trust appeared at sane intervals. Pamplona, Donostia, San Sebastian. Pilgrim let the words enter him like warm food. He closed his eyes and read the timetable one last time in the dark of his own head. Columns, sidings, a soft hour when steel would forget itself, and then released it to other hands. A British desk where tea cooled forgotten. A pencil poised to pull teeth from a machine that had been chewing men since before dawn learned the trick of coming back. He opened his eyes. The world had edges again, not just risks. Fields, hedges, roofs, all the small inventory of peace pretending to believe in itself. Iker sat forward, elbows on knees, watching the road as if it were a patient with a fever. Gabby leaned back, face colourless under the day, hand braced on the door. Neither looked like a man who would be thanked. That was part of why the road worked. Pilgrim spoke without looking at them. "When this lands," he said, "men I will never meet will live who would have died. Trains will run wrong, teeth will crack." He paused. "It will not fix anything worth fixing, but it will make a hole." Iker's mouth tilted. "Holes are where rivers begin," he said. Gabby allowed half a smile, "And where men crawl through walls," he added, and rested his head back with the first permission he'd given himself all day. The road bent south. Snow lifted from the fields like breath the earth had been holding. Far behind, the Pyrenees kept their own council. Black stone, white breath, the grammar of a country older than papers. Ahead, the day opened like a hand offering work. Pilgrim set his palm on his knee to quiet the last shake. He thought of Lorea tracing his lifelines and making him an uncle for an hour, of Maya Allen's left-corner smile and her argument with uniforms, of the brewery boy's stillness, of Ita Xavier's bell and the soft twin kisses that meant flood and dog and men, of Unai and Jocse and their municipal crate that spilled nothing, of Amaya's lauburu burned into a beam and a tiny tin that smelled like courage when courage had a recipe, of the old man at the border and his turnip and the minutes he had spent like coin, of the oxen's bell, frantic then still, of Iker's brother's last unwritten letter, of the Gernika photograph and men whose eyes had already refused once, of a Legion coat that told the truth at the price printed on the label, of a mountain that had said yes and no and yes again and still let them pass. He took a breath that did not cost more than it gave. Sideways until up, he thought. Up until over. The car rolled on. The longest step had been small, a boot on wood, then stone, one country to another. The rest would be longer and duller and dangerous in ways that needed different courage. But for a sentence of road, he let himself believe that victories measured in inches can change maps measured in miles. The driver shifted gears. The city gathered ahead. Behind them, snow began to write over their tracks. The ridge watched and said nothing. The day, at last, belonged to the work that waited.
This was The Longest Step, written by Beryl Coops. I hope you enjoyed my short story. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. I have written over 500 short stories over the years under many pen names. I will be updating these and recording them under the Beryl Coops name. I will be listing them on YouTube as fast as we can get them recorded. They will include historical drama, humor, adventure, romance, period drama, mystery, thriller, war stories, spy stories, revenge, horror, psychological horror, dystopian, disaster, children's stories, love stories, and more. Too many to name. Something for everyone. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up. It helps others find my channel. Until next time, thank you for listening to the end.